Hello everybody, my name is Dave Jackson and you're listening to Tales from the Backlog. And this is a video games review podcast where each week I'm joined by a guest to bring a game out of the backlog, play it, and discuss. I have two guests with me today. They are both friends of the show, both hosts of the Retro Spectives podcast, and they're going to solve this case, aren't they, Zach? Want to welcome to the show James Turlings and Patrick Arthur. Welcome, guys.
How you doing?
Hey, thanks so much for having us on, Dave.
Of course. Returning the favor, of course, for you two having me on your show to talk about Killer 7, which was a really fun conversation. We have another equally weird game to talk about today. I think we picked good ones, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Like, we picked a very bizarre game when you guessed it on our show, and this one might just be even weirder, funnily enough.
I would say equally weird, but yeah, we can't possibly be doing a normal game, Dave. That'd be far too mainstream.
Exactly, yeah. Today, we're going to talk about Deadly Premonition, which is an open-world survival horror game developed by Access Games and published by several publishers, depending on the region. In North America, it was Ignition Entertainment, and this came out on the Xbox 360, PS3, and PC in 2010, and there's also a version on Switch, if that is the only way you can play it. This was the winner of a poll on Patreon for the October Horror Games, so thank you to the patrons for voting and getting this game onto the show. And if this is your first time listening to the show, first of all, thanks for stopping by. Here's how the spoiler policy works. It is the same as every episode of the show. We're not going to spoil what happens in the story for a while. We're going to discuss basically everything else that we can discuss, and then we'll put up that spoiler wall. We'll tell you when those spoilers are going to come out, so you can jump out if you don't want to know what happens here. There's also a timestamp down in the episode description, so you can jump out anytime. So, what is Deadly Premonition? We have some quick elevator pitches for you, and because I'm the host, I'm going to steal the easy pitch. I say the elevator pitch for Deadly Premonition is, this is Twin Peaks, the video game. Guys, what would you say?
Yeah, as somebody who hasn't actually watched much of Twin Peaks, I gave it a quick watch, and yeah, I think it's pretty damn accurate. The way I'd sum up this game is either the best awful game I've ever played, or, big city FBI agent goes to small rural town and finds some weird shit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm a bit more familiar with Twin Peaks. I've seen the first two seasons, but it was quite a while ago, and I didn't watch it at the time in which it was released, so I'm no expert. But I can definitely say the Twin Peaks influence here is enormous. Specifically, my elevator pitch is Twin Peaks meets Shenmue, because I think that while Twin Peaks is definitely the main aesthetic influence, Shenmue, a game I haven't even played, but a game that I'm very familiar with, mechanically, it feels very inspired by Shenmue.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I haven't played Shenmue either, but you can absolutely see that. I played this for the show on my Xbox 360. I went out and got a physical copy of the game. I own it on Steam, and when I went to boot it up, I thought, hey, let me just check on the reviews and see what people are saying. And most of the reviews are like, this game doesn't even fucking run on Steam, so play it elsewhere. So I went and bought an Xbox 360 copy. I played it all there. It took me 18 hours to play. How did you guys play this?
Yeah, so I kind of went down the route you did initially with the Steam version, and much, similarly to you, it just would not run on my computer. Eventually gave up and looked for a physical copy, but in Australia, you're pretty out of luck when looking for older titles like this, so ended up emulating the PS3 version of the game. And, even with following every guide in the book, this game still ran like crap. And I don't think that that's a problem with the emulator. I think this game's just kind of poorly made, to be honest.
Yeah, I also emulated the PS3 version. It was a bit finicky to set up, a bit more involved than most emulation stuff that I've done. You have to get the BIOS and a couple of other steps. But for me, it ran, reasonably well. The main graphical glitch I had was some serious texture flickering, but it kind of solved itself over time. It was never a super consistent issue. It kind of felt like the longer the game ran, the worse the texture flickering got. But I could just reset the emulator and we were back to normals. But it was functional, and I think that the PS3 version is generally regarded as the best if you have a way to access it.
Yeah, the Xbox 360 version did have some of that that flickering like you talked about too. It ran fine. It didn't crash or anything like that. So like, again, compared to what I was probably in for with the Steam version, it ran fine. The only thing was, and I was like kind of following a GameFAQs guide as I was playing, there were some people saying like, there's this bug. If you pick up a key, do not save and quit the game because the key will disappear and you'll soft lock yourself. So other than that, I made sure to not do that and it was fine. But it kind of does feel like the game's held together with, bubble gum and duct tape and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Even watching yesterday, because I missed some of the side quests, I thought I'd, refresh myself and just watch some guy play through all of them. Even in the native PS3 port, you saw a lot of problems with the shadows and the textures and a bit of stutter occasionally. I don't think you're going to get this game to run perfectly no matter what you do.
Right. So let's start, as always, with our histories with this game in particular. And I had given you guys a list of games that, were going to be in that poll on Patreon. We basically just picked 4 games that you guys thought would be cool. And then this was the winner. So this is what we're doing. But obviously you had both heard of this game before. So tell me about your personal histories with Deadly Premonition. Did you actually want to play it before I asked you to do it for the show? Stuff like that.
My only experience with this game was seeing it on the store shelves the week it came out and thinking, holy shit, this game looks edgy, and then never looked into it further until this last few weeks.
That cover is definitely of the time, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I'd heard of this game vaguely, but I didn't really know anything about it. Based on what I initially read, it sounded really intriguing. James and I really like these kind of more, indie is the wrong word, but niche cult classics. One of the best ones we played was a Slavic game called Gorky 17, which I think, is the kind of game that got a lot of 7 out of 10s. But to our delight, when we played it, it was absolutely incredible. So I was really looking forward to seeing exactly what made this game tick, find out why it had such a large cult following, even if it, received a lot of middling reviews by the press.
Yeah, for sure. This is one of those 7 out of 10 games as it's become more popular for people to kind of seek these out, which I think is a good thing, that people are, obviously you want to play the best of the best, but people have seemingly been more and more interested in these flawed, but ultimately pretty good in a lot of cases games that have a lot of heart and character and stuff like that really stick out. So that was what made me want to play Deadly Premonition. Like, I knew of its reputation as a game like this, that a lot of people think this game's terrible. A lot of people love it with their whole heart. And it just kind of ends up being one of those games that, like, people say it's got a lot of cool stuff about it. It's got a lot of bad stuff about it too. And it just kind of falls in that range where it's like, check this out, but know that it's not going to be the best game that you ever played. So I'm into that kind of stuff too.
On that note, Dave, I think that there are actually kind of 2 kinds of types of 7 out of 10 games. They're the ones which are like a little bit above average, and then they're the ones which are polarizing. You have ones that receive a lot of 7 and 8s out of 10s, and then you have the games that receive a lot of 2s and a lot of 10s. And I think Deadly Premonition definitely falls into that latter camp.
I agree. I think another one this year on the podcast, I did God Hand, which is another one of those that's like, the average might be at 7 out of 10, but people either like love or hate God Hand. There's really no in between.
I find that with those kinds of games, I normally fall into one of the camps. Like, I either agree with the 2 out of 10 people or the 10 out of 10 people wholeheartedly. If I was reading reviews for this game, I would agree with the people giving it 2s and 10s at the same time, right?
I was just going to say that, like, my kind of like big takeaway from this game is I would agree with both sides. Just like you said, if someone said this game is trash, I would be like, there's a lot of trash like stuff that you're doing in this game. And if someone said this was like one of their favorite games, I'd be like, I can see why this would be one of your favorite games. Like, I think that there's a big chunk of what this game is. And I think like what the creator's main intention for this game is that Shenmue style, like simulation of the town, going around talking to people, doing their side quests, getting to know them as you solve the case. And I think a lot of that stuff is really, really good. And then you just do a lot of some of the worst third-person shooting I've ever done in this game. So that's where I would agree with the 2 out of 10 crowd as well. And where I really landed on this is that I have a lot of these like really polarizing games that I really enjoy, and I make like a part of my gamer personality to be like, I fucking love God Hand. I love Rain World. I love these games. Deadly Premonition's not going to be in that category because you just do too much of the bad part for me personally. But I do like a lot of what this game is doing.
So for me, Dave, I don't know if we're moving on to our overall impressions. I'm definitely in the camp of hating this game. You guys talk about how there's upsides and downsides. Hell, even for me, a lot of what you're describing as the enjoyable parts of the game, I absolutely hated because of the time it took to do a lot of those actions. It's not a small town. I'm sure we'll get more into this later, but I definitely fall into the camp of this being one of the worst games I've ever played, and I'm very eager to discuss it further.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm definitely, like, I agree with everything Patrick's going to say about the gameplay and things like the driving and just the amount of time that the game wastes. But on the other hand, we have 10 out of 10 things, like every time the main character says the word Zack after muttering to himself for like 5 minutes, or or the fishing scene, or it's just some truly incredible writing in this one.
Yeah, I think that this game does span like the entire range of enjoyment. And I streamed a lot of this on Twitch, so like if I remember to put this on the YouTube channel, people can see me go through like just the absolute pits of like, another fucking combat section. Like, are you kidding me right now? All the way up to, when big story beats are going on and there's like crazy cool stuff happening and me just being like, this is awesome. I love this. And everything in between.
Honestly, streaming or playing with friends seems like the ideal way to engage with this game, in the same way that watching like a terrible horror movie with friends is enjoyable. So I can see how that would make the experience more fun.
For sure. There were a lot of people in the Twitch chat saying things like, I wouldn't play this for myself, but I'm enjoying, watching it with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Normally when I'm playing one of the games for the show, I'll like talk to my friends about, what's been happening in the game, and, depending on the game, they'll show different levels of interest. For this game, every single time I had a funny story about the game to tell people. They listened the entire time. It was very entertaining. It was probably like more confusing from a second-hand point of view, listening to all of the just trying to explain the fishing section to 3 people who had no idea what was going on was incredible.
Yeah. There is a lot to dig into, so let's put a pin in this. Let's listen to a bit of music from Deadly Premonition, and when we come back, we'll set up the story for everybody. We'll talk about what's going on around town. In Deadly Premonition, you play as FBI agent Francis York Morgan. Please call him York. That's what everybody calls him. And York goes to the small town of Greenvale, Washington, to investigate the grisly murder of a young woman. And York takes special interest in this case because certain aspects of the murder follow a pattern set by other murders across the country. So this is what we're doing. We have a murder mystery. You play as an FBI agent. And before, getting into more nitty-gritty things around town and stuff like that, I just want to say no spoilers about what happens in the case, but I thought the case itself, like at its core, this is a mystery that we're uncovering. I thought it was a lot of fun to go through the beats of the case.
Yeah, I agree. And like a lot of mysteries, I think it's generally stronger at the start of the narrative, but I think they did a good job of presenting a lot of different possibilities for the answer. Like, there are a lot of good red herrings in the game. Like, part the way through the game, I was convinced it was the main character who was actually the murderer. And then there was all sorts of stuff happening. So I thought they did a pretty good job of that. And the this kind of like mixture of, is it supernatural? Is the main character just crazy kind of thing? Added a lot of depth to the mystery that I was, the resolution, I'm generally of the opinion that most murder mysteries don't live up to the initial suspense, but they at least tied things off all right, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found that the central mystery here and the way it unfolded to probably be the strongest part of the game. There's a great sense of intrigue as it progresses. Definitely every time I finished a scene, I was eager to see what was coming next. So yeah, this part of the game I agree with. I think that this is excellent. I will say there is a very personal connection that the detective or the main character has to the case, which I don't think worked super well in my opinion. It's not my favorite way for these mysteries to resolve themselves. So I thought that part of it was a little unsatisfying as it moved towards a resolution. But broadly speaking, I think the intrigue and setting and everything came together extremely well.
Well, that's good. Like, I'm glad, like, even if, the overall experience of playing the game was not your jam, I'm glad that, like, at least following the mystery pulled you through decently well.
Absolutely. I think there's a mistake some people make when they're evaluating their experience with games, where they're like saying, so each, story gets 2 points, gameplay gets 2 points, level design gets 2 points. And then they say, okay, so I add all these numbers up and that means that this game is a 6 out of 10. I don't think that's a very, it doesn't feel like a very accurate way to evaluate your sum total experience. So even if I hated this game, that doesn't mean there's nothing of value to take away from it. For sure. In the exact same way that there are games that I'd give 9 out of 10 and 10 out of 10, and there'd be aspects of those games that I'd still loathe and hate to pieces. I think it's, review scores are ultimately just it's a clumsy mechanism for summarizing how we feel about a game. It's very surface level.
Yeah, 100%. And like, that's the beauty of, doing a podcast like this or like your podcast, is that there are games that I hate that I spend, a half hour heaping praise on because there are good things about it. But overall, I can't stand them. By the time people hear this, the Dave the Diver episode will have released and you can hear all about that.
I'm very much looking forward to
that. Man, I was thinking about you last night, actually, because one of my friends joined our Discord and he said, I've just been playing Dave the Diver for 9 hours straight. And I strongly remember hearing you say that you loathed that game.
Yeah. So it's like, that's the beauty of, really unfolding the game and talking about all of its pieces, is that, you can talk about praise where praise is due, even if it is something that you super dislike, or vice versa. Like you said, even my favorite games, there's stuff that I don't like about them. So that's just the way it is. One thing that I like about Deadly Premonition, kind of staying at this, introductory level to the story, is I really like York as a character and as a protagonist and a vehicle to take us along through the case. He is a fucking weird guy, and I really enjoyed basically every time he talked. Like, you never know what he's going to start talking about. And he's just, he's a special boy, York is.
I think they did a really good job with the main character for a few reasons. Firstly, his voice actor did a really good job with the character from start to
Jeff
finish.
Kramer doing the voice for York.
Secondly, I think something for me, at least personally, for mystery shows, I much prefer it when the main character is competent at their job, is able to make reasonable or ridiculous, in this case, logical deductions, and generally have a sense of agency over the investigation. And York is coming into this, A, in a position of power as an FBI agent, and B, he's pretty good and knowledgeable, in his field of study. Like, he's always talking about the experiences he's had as an FBI agent and that kind of thing. And then, thirdly, I think it's pretty clear that generally in writing, characters with big flaws are just much more engaging. And York has a lot of personality flaws. Like, he's kind of crazy. Yes. He's a bit of an asshole, and he doesn't, really notice that he's been an asshole, half of the time. So,
yeah.
And this is kind of a hard line to write for a main character, because you need to make them flawed, but in a way that's endearing, but not so endearing that it kind of invalidates the flaw. Like, in this same game, they gave Emily this, this very common character flaw, being bad at cooking, that just makes me roll my eyes every time I see it. That's not a real flaw. York, however, there's a lot wrong with this guy.
So part of the reason that this character feels so compelling is that of all the Twin Peaks influences, this is probably the most obvious one. He's modeled very heavily after Agent Cooper from Twin Peaks, who is an FBI agent who comes to a town to investigate a murder. And even a lot of his idiosyncrasies are taken straight from the show. Like, in the show, Cooper is always narrating his thoughts to a tape recorder, speaking to Diane. In this, he's speaking to what's his name? Speaking to Zach all the time. I can't believe I forgot this. The delight that he takes from small and ordinary pleasures, like the way he loves his coffee, the way he loves, the food people make, directly from the show. His oddball nature, his complete and utter confidence, I guess. It's arrogance, but also just calm confidence, directly from the show. And I agree with you guys. I think that he's an excellent character, and I think that it is an interesting spin, but it's hard for me to play this game and not think that they just wholesale ripped off the character, because that's absolutely what they did. Not to the game's detriment, but the influence here is very stark.
I was going to ask you, because I didn't watch Twin Peaks, and I knew that you had experience with it. So, when I was playing this on Twitch, some people in my chat were just being like, yep, that's Twin Peaks right there. I'm like, oh, inspired? They're like, no, that's literally exactly from Twin Peaks, just over and over again. But I can't really pick things out. I just know that Twin Peaks has this kind of uncanny thing about it. That's all I know, though. So if you could elaborate a little bit more on how Twin Peaks is this.
Yeah, so I do want to start specify that I'm not a Twin Peaks expert. There are people. Yeah. This is the kind of show that has a cult following where people have studied it to death. So I don't want to go into this saying I know Twin Peaks. I know everything about it. I'm more of a casual viewer, but I am a big fan of David Lynch. The thing about Twin Peaks is that it has a sinister and creepy and disturbing feeling to it that's always present, but always around the edges. And there's a lot of goofy scenes in Twin Peaks, but they're more slightly off kilter, I guess, as opposed to being purely comedic. This is very, very similar to Twin Peaks in most ways, except that the outright horror or Lovecraftian elements are far more in your face. And I would argue, and I will argue later on, that that's ultimately to the game's detriment. So the sense of horror in Twin Peaks is a lot more. Yeah, I don't want to say subtle, because it's not like it's super subtle. Like the weirdness is front and center, but the feeling of something being deeply and fundamentally wrong that truly those supernatural elements are far more in the background than they are in this game.
Mm-hmm. You can feel that when you're playing this game, like there is just something off about the town and stuff like that. But there is a lot of like really in your face horror. Like there are these shifts to this dark world. This is a really gory game at times. I don't know if Twin Peaks is like that, but
no,
it's not. So Deadly Premonition is very fucking gory in like 3 or 4 particular scenes. But so, yeah, I think that you're definitely right. Like, it sounds like this is much less subtle in those horror areas for sure.
Interestingly, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but there was a demo or a showing of this game at one of those E3 kind of conventions, and it was even more obviously Twin Peaks inspired to the point where they had to change things because of fear of being sued, basically. So where this game started was even closer to Twin Peaks and where it ended up.
Jeez. It's really interesting. So another thing about this game, you know, one of those things that I think sets like that horror kind of on the outside of, like, on the periphery, I guess, is there's this, like, I don't want to say like it's always there, but there is like this supernatural aspect to it, and there's like a mythology and folklore that's important to the story of this game. And it's not like there's cryptids roaming about all the time or something like that, but there's, you know, it feels like a classic horror thing, but there's these little kids who talk about, like, the girl who got killed, she's actually a goddess of the forest and stuff. So, like, they're attuned to, you know, those types of things. There's that. There is the killer that's going around town mirrors a killer from folklore in the town. So it's like a copycat, or is it type situation. And we have this, in the game opens, by the way, with I don't remember if it like opens or like if it's after the first cutscene or something, but you're in this like otherworldly red room with, like, you know, a TV and like a couple of chairs and a weird little kids in there, and there is this weird fantasy aspect to this game too, but it's not there all the time.
Yeah, and I generally think that the game's stronger when it's doing things in a more maybe subtle and confusing way. Like, I think the room sections were pretty effective of what they were trying to do. I think talking to the kids who are maybe not seeing things that other people can't see, that kind of creepiness is so much better and more effective than getting dumped into the zombie world and fighting zombies for 40 minutes or something. You know, when it's, like, in your face, and particularly near the end of the game when they start, like, ripping the veil off, it starts to fall a bit, like, the pull of the game started feeling a bit less to me. I was getting less invested the more they were showing explicitly.
Yeah, so the comparisons that come to mind, and I've got two because they're both crime shows and they're both set in Louisiana. And we talked about this. We not too long ago, we did an episode on an old point-and-click adventure game, Gabriel Knight, Sins of the Fathers. Is that one you're familiar with at all, Dave?
Just by name.
Yeah, so that has voodoo as a strong element, but it's one that grows and becomes more insidious as the plot progresses. And then there's the more modern television show, one of my favorites of all time, True Detective. Which has that same sort of like supernatural things hovering in the background, and with it gradually becoming more, coming into the foreground more as the show progresses. And I think that both of that old game and True Detective do a far better job of introducing their supernatural elements because it's not as visible and it's gradually introduced, and as a result, you're a lot more creeped out by it than in these zombie shooting bits.
Yeah, in Deadly Premonition, you are introduced to supernatural things pretty quickly as you do, like you said, those zombie shooting sections. You do one of those in like the opening 30 minutes of the game. And you do a lot of those, as I said earlier. So you're always aware that there's something going on, and you don't get a real explanation for it for a while. That's one of the mysteries of the game, is why does York get transported, or get, why does the world change like this around him so often, besides, gameplay thing. We'll talk about that later. Why is this happening? You don't get an answer about that for a while, but it is very front and center the entire game. Another thing about the story that I think is really cool is a lot of the building up of the town, we'll say, of Greenvale. So like you're following the beats of the case as you go around, you interview people, you have different suspects throughout the course of the case. And throughout all of this, you'll meet the inhabitants of the town of Greenvale. And this game is open world. So for a lot of the time, you're pretty free to like pursue leads when you want to, and then go talk to people around town as you please. There are a lot of side quests for the townsfolk, and I didn't do a lot of the side quests, but I did think that basically all of the townsfolk were at least interesting. And like, let's say I was going someplace and I saw one of the townsfolk like in the diner or something like that, I would go talk with them because I thought that they were all charismatic and interesting characters in their own right.
I'd agree with that. I think this is like one of the game's strengths and weaknesses, actually, is that they did a really good job of interconnecting the histories of every single character in the town to the town itself, to each other character, like you can talk to them. And then they did this thing where, you know, they were going for the full open world Shenmue thing where every character has like a schedule that they follow, and you can follow them around their day-to-day lives and talk to them, and they'll have different things to say depending on where they are and the time of day and that kind of thing. And you can get a lot out of the game by doing that and following people around and doing side quests, of which there's quite a few actually. Where I think this is kind of disappointing is that because the premise of the game is this mystery, you're a detective, you're trying to solve things, and the actual case follows a very linear progression. Like, these side quests ultimately can't really change the course of the game, and often, like, lots of these will give you hints as to the real, you know, the culprit of the murders, and everything at the end of the game, but in these side quests, York, who is normally very, you know, very clever, very logical, able to jump to crazy conclusions, his brain just kind of like falls out of his head, and there'll be these super obvious clues for the player that he'll just completely ignore because he can't, right? That'd change the way the game plays out. So
right.
It kind of is a bit disappointing. I think the structure of this detective story kind of mandates that these side quests are ultimately unrewarding. But in terms of giving like a better perspective of the town itself, I think they did a really good job.
It's actually, that's a fascinating point that you brought up, James. So basically, I did none of these side quests just because I was not enjoying the game and I was trying to progress through it as fast as I could. I like the idea of these side quests or a story, or a story that's more presented as a web, you know, more vignette focused as opposed to being so focused on the main story. It's something that the anime Monster does extremely well, and a more recent game that kind of does something similar, I think, is Disco Elysium, and it's a really excellent way to do storytelling. This feels like a missed opportunity because we'll get into it more later, of course, but the essential gameplay on display here is not good, whereas here was the potential to make something of the whole detective aesthetic of the game, right? And you can imagine a version of this game where the gameplay is more focused on solving the mystery and having that integrated into the plot with you gathering clues and evidence from all these different sources. But unfortunately, back in this day and age, people hadn't really figured out how to turn detectiving into gameplay like we see in more modern games like Obra Dinn, Case of the Golden Idol, or even something like Paradise Killer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The big reason that I didn't do a lot of the side quests is, like you just said, Patrick, the side quests that I did pursue ended up being combat challenges when I like came down to it. And the combat in this game is just the worst. So that put me off of pursuing other side quests. And the other part of it is the characters all run on a schedule. And a lot of times, like if you're doing the main quest, like you'll finish the main quest at like 8 or 10 p.m. and you can't go talk to a lot of these characters because they're in their house and the door's locked and you just can't. You got to wait till tomorrow.
The schedule ends up being my least favorite part of the game. I'll just say it now. Like, the fact that some main quests end and you want to do the next one to see what'll happen, and you need to waste, 12 hours before you can do it. And sleeping in your bed, you can skip ahead time, but the increments are so poor that a lot of the time you just end up sitting there for an hour anyway with the game open.
Do you know about the cigarette? Smoking cigarettes makes time pass faster?
Yeah, that's the other thing. That's what cigarettes are for in the game. Is they
in real life.
That's true. Yes, they will make time pass like hilariously fast. Like the clock is going wild, and like there's a couple times I almost overshot the time I was trying to get to because the clock is going so fast when smoking. But James, that was exactly what I was going to say. Like the fact that. And this is like a really ironic, unintended consequence of this whole thing. But the fact that I was really invested in the case, and every time I was set to like do things on my own, it was like, do you want to follow the main story or do you want to go around town and talk to people and maybe do some side quests? I wanted to follow the main story, not because I didn't want to talk to the people, but because I liked the main story so much. That's what I wanted to do. And so it's partly because the side quests that I did actually do were not good, but it's mostly because I just wanted to do the main story. That was my primary reason for turning the game on.
Yeah, I really wish they had integrated these with the main quest better. Like, if they had made all of these side folk missions, part of getting the clues to solve the next part of the mystery, I would have, beelined those side quests, right, to get to the main story as quick as possible. And then, some of the quests have this problem where it's why is my FBI agent helping this lady clean the storeroom in the grocery store?
Yeah, pushing boxes back there, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it all feels like a consequence of them. Basically, with this game, they would have written the main story first, right? They would have written the main story and damn, we need to turn this into a video game. How are we going to do that? Well, we have to make this setting good and put all these characters in it. Let's all give them, let's give them personalities, and they've got to interact with the detective in some way. So what would this lady do? Oh, she'd have a dirty storeroom, so now the detective can do that. Oh shit, we probably need to add some gameplay to this game as well. So it feels like these things cascaded in order, as opposed to them coming up with a holistic identity from this game and building it all together. At least that's the way it feels to me. And I think this is something that's actually common of a lot of games of this era, in that these heavy narrative-driven experiences almost hate the idea that they're a video game, or the video game aspect they really don't think is important, so they marginalize it or don't pay much attention to it. It's very frustrating to play these games as a consequence. One of the things that I think that modern games tend to do better is that or modern indie games specifically, is that they have a holistic idea for the gameplay and story, or they have the confidence to not have gameplay at all. What walking simulators have essentially become. And I wish that Deadly Premonition had come out in an era where the concept of a walking simulator was more widely acceptable, because we might have got a much better product as a consequence.
I'm convinced that this game would be better as a Telltale game or a visual novel or something more along those lines, right? I think that this game during development probably had a bit of a troubled planning process. I felt like they just had a lot of big ideas and they wanted to do all of them, and as a result they tried to cram this game with as much stuff as possible. So we have a lot of different interlinking systems that don't have a lot of depth to them, like things like collecting the points around the town, like those little badges that are, behind this fence. Did anybody really get enjoyment of collecting those? I don't think so.
Yeah, you go out of your way to pick up one of those and get, $12 or something like that, when you don't really have anything to buy for most of the game anyway. So it's funny you guys mention putting the pieces together of, we have this world, we're going to fill the world with these characters. And I think the characters are really fun and interesting to talk to. And I love how their histories all weave together like a small town would. And then this game, I did read an interview with the director where they did say combat was added very late in the process at the command of the publisher. That the publisher said, this game's not going to sell if it doesn't have a combat system. So they did it, and we'll get there. But like, I 100% agree. This game would be way better if it had no combat whatsoever. If it was just drive around town, talk to people, do some errands, side quests, someone says they lost their thing or this person stole this thing from me, I need you to go get it back. Like, this game would be much better with no combat, or if combat was like in very specific places, then it would fit better. It's just, there's way too much. And I think if you ask the director, they would probably agree with us.
You can just imagine the publisher saying it needs combat, it needs quick time events, it needs boss battles,
It's 2010, so I agree. I think one of the coolest things about newer games, and especially from the indies, is the confidence to just not put combat in your games.
Completely agree.
Like in Disco Elysium, or like in what's another one? I can't remember.
Any walking sim, like What Remains of Edith Finch or anything. Like, a lot of people panned Gone Home when it first released, which I thought was a very disappointing response, because Gone Home was a trailblazer in a lot of ways in having the confidence to tell a story in first person without having anything else. And since then, we've seen walking simulators really take off. So I think that either this game being a walking simulator or having a gameplay system that tied more into this concept of being a detective would have been ideal.
Well, we're on the subject of gameplay, so let's just get into what it's like to play this game in particular. So it's an open world game. Most of the time you get around by driving. York has a master key where he can get into any cop car in the city, which I think is pretty funny. And there is a side quest you can do. So if anyone's listening to this and thinking that you want to try this, please do the side quest for George, the sheriff, so that you can fast travel around town. That is an absolute game changer, because driving in this game is not good. And the town is huge, and this game has one of the worst maps I think I've ever experienced in a game. So I probably spent, 8 of my 18 hours just very frustrated with navigating the town. And then I finally... Not that I learned the town so much. I just figured out, okay, this is how this map works. Oh, it's not consistently north is not always pointing up on the map. It changes depending on where you're facing, which is just navigating the town fucking sucks.
90% of the problem is that the map screen doesn't let you zoom out far enough.
No, it does not.
And
it's
B,
terrible.
The markers aren't always on the map. This game needed A, a GPS, B... One thing, when I started playing, the first time I got into a car, it presented me the control scheme. And one of the things that the control scheme had was the indicators. You can turn your left and right indicator on in this car.
Yeah.
And the very first thing that George said to you when getting in the car was, you better drive carefully. So I don't know if you guys did this, but I legit drove very carefully, used my indicators, stopped at traffic lights. And then as the game went on was wait a second. If I plow through these barricades, they won't say anything. There's no dialogue for any of this. What?
Yeah.
You are crazy, James. I don't know why anyone would do that.
I was they went to the effort of putting these controls in. It must have a purpose. Literally worthless.
I did that too at the beginning when it was George and York are not on good terms because George is kind of protecting his turf. York is a dickhead. I didn't want to, I didn't know what would happen. So I drove carefully at the beginning too. The other reason I drove carefully is your car cannot go over like 50 miles an hour for a while until you upgrade the car. So like you can't really speed. You can mildly speed. Like you might not even get a ticket going at the max speed in this car.
I really liked that in the cop cars, like turning the police siren on, like unlocked the speed limit.
Yeah,
and
you can go like 10 miles an hour faster.
It was like 5 miles an hour faster. It was basically nothing. I was so frustrated at it. The other reason I didn't bother trying to drive carefully is because obviously in Australia we drive on the left-hand side of the road instead of the right-hand side, and I knew that I'd mess it up. I knew that I'd get confused at one point with all of the lanes back to front. So I said, "Fuck this! I'm not going to learn how to drive in American lanes."
There's also all of these shortcuts all over town that have these wooden barricades that you can just smash through, and they'll be like...
Which are not marked on the map either.
No, but there'll be lots of points like in those areas to reward you for, breaking the law or whatever. I don't know. It's especially good because it's it's presented as Agent's Honor, FBI street cred for...
Yeah.
It's awful.
The handling on the car is atrocious as well. Like, you can barely turn corners. I don't know if there's a way to, like, brake or handbrake to take corners, but I was very, very bad at cornering when I was going at max speed.
It's rough, and, like, the thing about the car is you don't turn smoothly. So, like, whenever you press left or right on the stick when you're driving, it will jerk at, like, 15-degree intervals. Instead of like, a smooth turn like, a lot of games do. So it's really frustrating to just like drive in a straight line a lot of times in this game because you don't want to like run face first into another car or like run off the road or something. So you want to try and stay in your lane, but the roads they're weaving, country roads and stuff. It's annoying.
I think part of the problem is that James and I just recently have come off playing Gran Turismo 4, which has slightly better driving physics than this game.
Slightly.
So to go from that game to this one felt especially bad. Like, it felt like a punch in the gut. I'm like, what are we even doing here?
Yeah, I ran out of fuel a few times too, but luckily the game gives you these flares which you can just fire off to have a brand new car with a full fuel tank delivered to you at anywhere in the town.
Yeah. So eventually, so the other thing about driving I wanted to mention, because it's weird, it kind of adds to that weird feeling about the town in general, but it makes it really fucking frustrating when you're trying to navigate, is the streets change every single time there's an intersection. The names change. So one block you'll be driving on Donovan Street. You don't make any turns. Next block you're on Batman Street or whatever. Then the next block you're on like Bachman Road or whatever.
I didn't even notice that. I wonder if that's like a specific regional thing for where this game is set.
It can't be. It's just not how streets work. Like anywhere.
Yeah, I know. But you guys, the United States, don't the individual states have their own, I guess, local laws?
They do, but
but which one would like do this? It's just silly.
I can't imagine why.
I just thinking with a small town of this size, you might have a local city council do something weird, but I don't really know.
Yeah, if it is, it would be like the local city council, just being like, look how fucking wacky we are with our street names. But it's very frustrating to be like, I need to drive on this road, turn left on, whatever, like White Dove Road, and then you turn left, and then you look at the map and you're not on White Dove Road anymore. But you made the right turn. The street just changed names 2 times since you turned. It's very strange.
In my opinion, just while we're on the topic, the absolute worst thing, like I hate the fact that you can't zoom out on the map, but the thing that really grinds my gears is that, like the rest of this game, the worst part of it is the gameplay of driving. The best part about it is every time York decides to go on a tangent about his favorite movies, which makes the worst thing, every time you check the map, it just skips the current conversation that you're listening to. So half the time they'd be talking and I'd just sit there at the side of the road because I didn't know where to go, but I didn't want to cancel the dialogue. So, what do you do?
Or you need an auto drive button, right? You need a button, you press X and he drives and you can sit back and listen to the conversation and kind of let the vibes go over you instead of making the navigating a complete nightmare. And with that simple change, the experience would have been much, much better.
Yeah, like the Final Fantasy 15 auto drive would have been helpful because I used fast travel a lot later in the game, and it's really funny if you don't know. You get a radio from George, and you call what it is in game is you call George on the radio, and he comes to pick you up, and he drives you to the place. Like that's the lore explanation for how fast travel works. But you miss those York talking to Zach conversations, and they're all great. Like I love every one of those.
Even the ones with the other characters are great, because it's just like a whole car ride of the other characters like reacting wildly to Zach saying or York saying the most like outlandish bullshit you've ever heard.
Yeah. York just like has no...
He has no filter whatsoever.
He has no filter and no, like, he has never read a room once in his life.
It's more that he doesn't care, right? And I think that's kind of what makes him so compelling. It's not that he is trying to... He's not trying to keep the social peace. He is who he is. And if he offends someone, he does apologize. He'll be like, I understand you're offended, but this is just how I do things.
Yeah. When it comes to police matters, yeah, there's some like more personal moments later in the game where you're just watching and you're like, York, dude, fucking just like read the room, man. Like this is not the time for you to trauma dump or something like that.
I need you guys to take off your shirts.
Yeah.
Did you guys do that section where you had dinner with all the other police at the diner?
I think that's in the main quest, yeah. Or it's optional, but yeah.
Yeah, and you just go there and he just lists off the most horrific things that he's seen, as an FBI investigator.
Yeah.
And just the entire time, everyone is just getting, like, less and less comfortable eating their dinner.
Yeah, it's very good. So, the other part of, like, gameplay here is at certain points in the main quest, the town will shift, or like the environment will shift into like this dark world type thing. And these are more traditional, like survival horror style dungeon sections with a lot of combat. And it's from the Resident Evil 4 third person perspective. It has tank controls during this. And I just want to go on record as saying, I don't mind tank controls when you have the RE4 behind the character perspective. So in this, of all the things about the gameplay that I think are absolute dog shit, the tank controls, not one of them. I was surprisingly fine with them in here.
I actually didn't notice. It just felt pretty normal to me. I guess I've played a lot of third-person shooters that control like this.
Yeah.
But I have to say, like, this is easily the worst third-person shooter I've ever played. Like,
100%.
It is awful. Like, calling it survival horror is being generous. I don't think the word survival comes into this in any stretch. Like, I had so many healing items that I couldn't pick any up for, like, the entire game.
Yeah.
And you kill basically every single enemy in a single hit. The hitboxes are, like, they're extremely inaccurate, but in the favor of the player. Like, you can be, like, a mile away from a zombie and a melee hit will kill them. Is crazy.
Okay, with the melee weapons, those are super powerful. The guns are, at least your starter pistol,
Pretty bad.
Pretty weak. And
you got to hit headshots. That's what it boils down to.
You have to hit headshots, but you have to hit like 8 to 9 headshots. Like it's kind of ridiculous.
Really?
Did you guys get the Magnum later on?
It should just be generally it's 2 to 3 headshots, because if you basically need to stun them because a lot of them are blocking, and then the headshot will finish them off.
Interesting. Not my experience, but it's possible that I'm just not good at aiming.
I wasn't using lock-on at all, which might have affected it, because I know that you mentioned that you were using the lock-on function.
So there is a lock-on function, and the issue with the lock-on is that it does not lock on to the zombie's head. It locks on their crotch a lot of times, which is not the best place to shoot for, ethical and for damage, efficiency reasons. So, like, the lock-on for some enemies later is good, but for the standard zombies is terrible.
Okay.
And so you want to aim for headshots, and the reason, in my opinion, the reason this is the worst third-person shooter I've ever played is the aiming is incredibly fiddly and imprecise. It's a nightmare to try and get a headshot.
I also just think that, like, the main character in general, not just in the third-person scenes, but when you're just walking about in the overworld, just doesn't feel very good to control. Like, running is slow and jerky, movement is slow and jerky, transitioning between rooms is slow and jerky, even if you sprint when you open doors to do the quick animation. The attacks, like, the animations in this game do not flow smoothly from one into the other. They kind of go the entire way, stop, and very awkwardly begin the next one. It just, it doesn't feel good. Like, stuff like, there's this tiny little ledge, you need to walk up to it and press a button and watch an animation play of him take a second to step up onto the ledge. Whereas, like, in most games, he'd just run over it by holding forward or something.
Yeah.
Like,
You need to press it again to get off the ledge as well.
Yes, you do.
Just the worst.
Which is exacerbated when you're doing one of the many QTE sequences in this game.
The runaway
especially
sections.
When you're doing, there are chase sections where what you're doing is you have a constant QTE to wiggle the joystick back and forth to run during the chase sequences. And then you'll have other QTEs that come up to step over a 5-inch tall ledge and then step down from the 5-inch tall ledge, or push a box, or duck, or something like that. Those are bad, but they're not the worst QTEs in the game. The worst ones are the ones when an enemy will pop out and you have literally a split second to react to any one of the buttons on the controller. It's not consistent. So if you die, because again, the timer is 1 second.
Way less.
And it does,
like
and it
half a
feels
second.
less generous than that too.
Yeah.
If you die and you have to go redo that QTE section, the button's going to be different the next time you do it. So those are fucking awful.
Yeah.
Yeah, the one that killed me the most was the one early on in the lumber mill when you're in the elevator.
Yeah.
I legitimately died 3 times to that same one, and every single time I got to a new part of the QTE sequence, I failed it. I was like, man, I'm bad at video games.
The worst bits for me in the chase sections were pushing the boxes, because half the time you would move the box well out of the way, but then York wouldn't, like, step sideways and keep running. You'd need to push the box the entire way until it broke for some reason.
Yes. And in the final boss, there is a chase QTE sequence that's legitimately one of the worst things I've ever done in a video game.
It lasts for so long. It keeps going. Like, I thought I was, like, not doing something correctly, but it's just legitimately that long and repetitive.
Yeah. Now, there's another type of, like, sequence like this where an enemy will be, like, pursuing you and will, like, come into a room and you have to pick a place to hide, and you have to hide in there while they kind of search the room. There's certain places where they'll get up close, so you have to do a QTE to hold your breath, kind of like Until Dawn or something if you played that. Much simpler than Until Dawn even. But this seemed like it was something that, like, they wanted to do something cool with, but I couldn't pick up on any strategy in these. Like, I passed every single one. I don't know if it's literally just, like, hide anywhere or if there are good and bad hiding places. Did you guys, like, figure anything else about these?
I legitimately think it's hide anywhere and just hit the QTE button when it pops up.
Yep.
They take forever.
The thing that's annoying about these is that the presentation of it is quite cool. Like, you get, like, this split camera thing where you get to see the the Raincoat killer smashing down the door from their perspective at the same time as you're trying to hide. But once again, the gameplay here, it's almost non-gameplay. It's just you press the button as they're walking around the room, and there's no escalating tension or anything like that. It's just they wander around the room and you press the button. So ultimately, extremely disappointing.
I think the biggest misstep here is that they showed the character chasing you, like, up close too often during these sections. Like, if you had to hide and like you were in a locker and you could only look through these little slits and you could barely see the monster that was trying to kill you, I think that would have been way more tense than the camera focuses on his face the entire time. Like, kind of, most good horror shows that have like a spooky killer or monster do a good job of not showing them for the majority of the runtime.
I have to say, on that note, I don't know if you guys felt similar. I didn't find the Raincoat killer like even the slightest bit intimidating.
Yeah.
When I first saw him, I was like, oh, this must be the mini boss of the area. And then as the game progressed and it was like the main antagonist, I was like, what is even going on? Like, this isn't a scary thing for an FBI agent to deal with. This is the kind of thing that is a thing that would be scary for like a 16-year-old girl in a slasher film to deal with. This shouldn't be scary from the perspective of an FBI agent. You should have a threat that matches the fact that you have a gun and that you're a professional duder. And you need something, I think, far more substantive than a slasher villain, in my opinion. You need something like the Predator to match up to this, not a person with an axe and a raincoat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they kind of did realize that, because you don't get in boss fights with this thing most of the time. It's kind of, they put you in these chase or hide sequences with it, and then if you pass the QTE, it does like the Dikembe Mutombo finger wag at you and then like runs away and disappears. So
it's like why am I trying to shoot this guy? It's confusing.
Yeah, there is always that, but that's throughout a ton of works of fiction.
Oh, it's more like the game that comes to mind is the stealth horror Alien game.
Mm.
Like, the alien is a thing that you can't just shoot a bullet at and kill. Right, but a guy in a raincoat, like, you think you'd at least try it, and that was my problem with this. It didn't feel anywhere near as threatening as it seemed to be posing a problem for you.
I basically just think they should have never shown him at all until the end.
Yeah, that might have done it. I guess like the other thing about this is this game is not scary, like, in the slightest, even though it is a horror game, and we're talking about it in an October episode, but this is one of the least scary horror games I think I've ever played. It's partly because like the monster or the villain is not scary, but the rest of the vibe is more just kind of like uncanny than
creepy
horror, and it goes back to the killer too.
So I will say I broadly agree, but there are specific parts of this game that I did find scary, and those were the bits which more lent into the criminal violence that was occurring. So the points where I was feeling like actually disturbed are the ones that come to mind are the morgue scene where they're going over what's actually happened to this young girl, and the profiling scenes where you get to see like a blurred recreation of the killing and how it happened. And I think that in both those instances, maybe like horror scary isn't the right word, but I did find it deeply disturbing, and I thought it was effective in I guess portraying how disturbing serial killings and the kind of violence that was happening actually was. Like, it felt real to me. The rest of the time, no, but in those specific instances, it's so real that it's the kind of game that, while for the most part it has a goofy and light atmosphere, I don't think people under 18 should really play these games just because of how horrific those specific sequences are.
Yeah, those sequences are a lot. Like the profiling sequences in particular, the way they're presented, where you have a voiceover and then you have like some, it moves from just like still frame to still frame, but it's never like showing you the action really. I think the voice acting does a lot of really good work in those parts. The other thing about like the presentation of it, I think I talked about it earlier, but there are some really gory sections in here. There's two in particular that kind of like reminded me of like Saw type situations where, you have characters in like this very elaborate horror trap, and you're going to go try and help them out in there. And spoiler alert, you don't. It ends very poorly for them. And they're not really shy about showing somebody getting ripped apart or something like that. They really pick their spots with it, but they do present these things front and center.
The one you're talking about, that scene in the shower, is like one of the most like it's burnt into my mind kind of moments in the game. The game has, in general, a sense of dramatic flair to it when it's not in these shitty, I guess, publisher-enforced sections. Like, the opening cutscene with the kids in the tree, I thought was very, visually compelling. The same with that bathroom scene. They do a really good job of presenting scenes in this artful way sometimes that I think kind of makes these other more mundane, generic, like long and generic sections even more frustrating by comparison, because the people making this game really do have, the capacity to make these, jaw-dropping, eye-catching scenes, and it's just not consistent through the runtime of the game.
I think it really does stand out in contrast to those gameplay sections in particular, because the level design is extremely bland and uninteresting. It is a series of corridors and small rooms, and that's all it is. It doesn't really matter whether you're in a evil hospital or an evil lumber mill or whatever it is. It always boils down to a series of corridors and rooms with grimy walls, and it's very linear in how it pushes you down it, and it keeps cutting to, I guess you'd call them fake cutscenes. And we've kind of mentioned them before: the opening of the doors, or you getting up on a ledge, or you pushing a box. In addition to that, every time you open to a new room, it goes to a cutscene again, and it just is constantly interrupting any kind of potential flow you could get into to zoom through these levels. I hate it so much, guys. It makes me so angry every time I got into one of these. And then
I was really wondering about this, and it makes so much sense now that you've pointed out that the publisher mandated these be added to the game, because during the majority of these, the thing that was most confusing to me was that the main character doesn't talk at all. Outside of when you find the clues at the very end. And I reckon it's because they had already done all the voice recording and then they added these in afterwards.
Could be. There's another thing that I think they, it's kind of like a nod to how late this was added in, and that's how survival horror mechanics are handled. And I think this game does model these sections after survival horror games. In the way that you're going around, you're solving some light puzzles, you're, doing some stuff to pick up keys to get into new places of the levels. And they have kind of survival horror mechanics with resource scarcity in the way that melee weapons are super strong, but they break pretty quickly. So if you want to use them, you got to pick your spots with them. But your pistol has infinite ammo, literally infinite ammo. You don't pick up ammo for it. It's just infinite. The other guns have limited ammo, but you pick up a lot of ammo for it. So you can just use the shotgun for the whole game after you pick it up. You'll be fine. You might have to switch guns a couple times, but I think the fact that the pistol has infinite ammo is the developer being this just fucking get infinite ammo, get through this and get to the part that we want you to do,
Yeah. It's very anathema to the concept of survival horror. It just reduces all the tension when your resources are just so plentiful. And later on you get the Magnum, which legitimately one-shots all enemies with a body shot. And then, those ones that crawl out of the vents and you kind of have to play the minigame of shooting them off the wall. It'll kill those in 3 shots as well, as opposed to I don't know, 40 with the pistol or something.
Yeah.
How did you guys feel about York saying things like "excellent" and "great shot" when he killed zombies?
Oh, love it, 100%.
I was immediately reminded of Killer 7. I'm like,
Nice.
so
Nice
these
shot.
guys are clearly big fans of Killer 7.
Yeah.
And the one thing they took away from that game is that when you kill enemies with headshots, your protagonist needs to say something, right?
Yeah, York needs to say, "You're fucked."
You're fucked.
This is just a really weird way to set up a, survival horror type situation. It led to me doing really weird stuff like shooting boxes with the gun to break them open so that I wouldn't hurt my melee weapons, which was what you would normally do. Or, God forbid, pushing them for 15 seconds until they break on their own.
Yeah.
It's like someone's read about survival horror mechanics without actually understanding how they work.
I think it's probably as simple as, this is so late. They're scrambling to put it together. They probably tested it out. They're like, this doesn't work. Just make the pistol have infinite ammo so they can get through these sections. Get back to the case. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, ultimately, I think the problem is the lack of escalation. Like,
yeah.
When I did the first one, I was like, this is fine for a tutorial. But they literally do not change. Like, the entire game, they play out exactly the same. They don't introduce new mechanics, really.
Or new enemies.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing is that you get those enemies that have guns. That was the only thing I can really think of where... But it's not like after they appear, you're always facing enemy with guns. They're still quite rare as you progress through the game.
Yeah. It's odd. So like we've gone through, a lot of good story stuff. And then I think I don't want to say like the whole act of playing the game was a chore for me personally, because I liked going around and talking to people. Like if I was driving to a mission and on the way there was some NPC houses, I would try and stop, or I would stop at the diner, or I would stop at the gas station because the people who run the gas station are fucking wacko. And stuff like that. So I enjoyed that stuff, but that stuff, if you were to make a pie chart of what I spent time doing in Deadly Premonition, that stuff is overshadowed by a lot by these dungeon combat sections. And these are just awful. I think the tutorial one, I was like, this doesn't feel great, but it's fine, I guess. And then, by the time you get to the later ones, it's just more enemies, longer dungeon, instead of having any interesting wrinkle to them. And it's a good point. One of you said, I don't remember, there's no if you're playing a Resident Evil game and going through a police station, it looks like a police station. You go in places that it's the evidence room and stuff like that. Deadly Premonition doesn't have that. It's just going through hallways, and then you might get to some rooms, transitional rooms that have a save point and a bed, or a dirty ass couch, because York can sleep anywhere, which is funny. But these could have been better if the level design was better, to better replicate I'm going through the Dark World Hospital, creepy ass hospital. I just played Silent Hill 1. Silent Hill does this, but their dark hospital section feels like an evil hospital. This doesn't. It's just hallways.
Silent Hill is the perfect comparison, because I think that Silent Hill generally has quite poor level design, particularly compared to Resident Evil, right? It's a lot of corridors and rooms splitting off those corridors. We've played Silent Hill 2, and it was one of my frustrations with that game. However, Silent Hill 2 does a much better job selling the aesthetic of the place, even if the physical layout of the levels is far less interesting than something like Resi. Deadly Premonition can't even get that right. So it's in a clear tier below even Silent Hill games level design.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've seen this come up a few times when playing the show, where I know that in about a year, I will have memory wiped all of these sections from my brain, and I will only remember the good parts of this game. I also had this with another game that we played on our show, Pathologic 1, which had amazing writing and characters, but equally horrific gameplay as this game. And it's one of my favorite games of all time because I have purposely mind wiped all of the bad out of my brain because, it's so dull and repetitive and unmemorable that I'm not going to remember it in 6 months.
Yeah, I just had a game like that on the show too with A Space for the Unbound, where I think the gameplay in that game is not great, and in some places is legitimately distracting from the story they're trying to tell, and it harms the product as a whole experience. But when you have separation from it, you will look back and be like, in the case of A Space for the Unbound, I'll remember the story and how it ended and how amazing it was. And this game will probably have that too, where I'll look back and I'll remember all the times that York is talking to himself or talking to Zach or being weird around the other characters. And I'll remember how the case progresses and all the fun twists and turns that it takes. And I will probably have that thing where it's like, oh yeah, I remember those combat sections sucked, but it won't be in the proportion that you spend time doing combat and dungeon sections when you're playing the game.
Yeah, broadly speaking, I feel like what this game wants for you to do is it wants you to immerse yourself in the town, right? It wants you to walk around, casually go speak to everyone, go fishing, kind of chill out and enjoy the world, enjoy the slow pace driving throughout the world, and kind of, become one with this world while also gradually progressing this kind of dark and horrible criminal plot. But the experience, I don't think, really lines up that way, and I don't think it will line up that way for most people.
There's a couple other things I want to just mention that kind of enhance the aesthetic, I will say, of playing the experience of playing the game, which is, first of all, I think the music is interesting and good in the game, but its utilization is really weird.
Yeah, it's I was convinced that this game had 8 songs, and then I went and looked at the soundtrack and was like, oh, it has 30 or 40, and I remember all of these. It's just the way I like the thing that it does where it changes the soundtrack quite dynamically during conversations to match what's going on. But there are a lot of instances in this game where the soundtrack is played at really inopportune moments. I remember when probably the third character gets murdered. Right after that, it is super depressing. And they just played one of the happy-go-lucky themes when characters were miserable. It wasn't that there was tonal whiplash, the characters started making jokes. And there's a lot of that too. But they legitimately play the wrong songs sometimes. Not just once or twice either.
Yeah, for me the music is just absolutely stunning at times. The two that stand out to me are The Woods and the Goddess, which is an acoustic theme that is absolutely beautiful from start to finish.
That's the one that plays at the main menu.
Yes, yeah. I think so. It also plays in the opening cutscene where the boys discover the... It plays there a few other times as well, but just absolutely incredible. And Underground is the other one which I really like, which is kind of like a off-kilter jazzy piece, which I think is really good because it captures the atmosphere of Twin Peaks in a way, and I think which is what this game is going for. The ones which I was less high on, not because they're bad pieces, but because they play so often, are FBI Special Agent, Life is Beautiful, and Comic Relief, which are a set of those three kind of lighter, I guess I'd call them this slice of life tracks of Deadly Premonition, which play very frequently whenever you're not dealing with something obviously horrific or they're trying to make the tone a bit lighter. And I, once again, these tracks aren't bad. It's just they feel way overused to the point where they sound silly.
Those three are actually some of my favorites, but just because they always play during the sections that I enjoy the most about the game, the bits where the characters are talking to each other, right? Like, whenever those themes are playing, I'm not engaging with the gameplay, which is always a good thing when it comes to this title.
Yeah, the thing with those is they do change during conversation, but they change so quickly. So, like, I understand having dynamic soundtracks matching the situation. It's something I like about, Final Fantasy games, for example, will do a lot of this. But in Deadly Premonition, you'll get 10 seconds of one song, then 20 seconds of the next song, then 10 seconds of another song, and then the conversation will be over. And I just don't think it should be switching that often. It's distracting when that happens. And I like the songs a lot individually, but their use in cutscenes is really weird and really stands out in a bad way, I think.
This game suffers from tonal whiplash. It will shift tones at the drop of a hat from something awful to something slice of lifey and positive, and it does it all the time. In fact, it does it so much to the point where it kind of becomes part of the aesthetic and identity of this game. I
agree.
Yeah, and I think that this is a part of the game that I didn't really like, because I tend to prefer media that have a more consistent tone. One of the reasons I hate a lot of anime out there is that I feel like they employ something similar here, but I can see this being part of the reason people love this game, because it really does embrace this ability to change tone completely at the drop of a hat.
Yeah, we've discussed this a few times. See, I'm in the opposite camp to you, like the polar opposite camp to you. I love this kind of thing, but I can absolutely see that this game in particular probably goes too far. Like, sometimes it was too much for me as well. But when they got it right, I think that it generally adds to this charm that the game has, where it's like equal parts creepy and unsettling and equal parts like slice of life following the characters around the fun town. And I generally find that games or media in general that have these darker tones to them, I find that darker themes to be more impactful when they're contrasted with these more lighthearted sections, but I generally even have to agree with you that they do it too much here.
It's just like, I get, you do want to have both, right? Like, I think that a lot of the darker things that would happen in something like The Last of Us have a little bit more impact because it's not like that all the time. Like, they do have comedic moments and stuff in those games too. So then when something horrific happens, you care a little bit more about whoever's involved in that. But this game will go through that range of things all in the span of the same conversation, which I just think is a little bit too much. It might mirror York and his personality a little bit, where he's, we have a grave situation, but York seems pretty detached from what's going on for a lot of the game. He doesn't seem too emotionally involved, we'll say.
I think that helps a lot, is just his deadpan attitude or his calmness towards every possible situation. And it's one of the reasons I ended up liking the character a lot, like just the way he takes everything at face value, even if it's completely ridiculous. And the way that his companions just completely contrast him, and because it's effectively like them playing the straight man while he just says the most ridiculous things like left, right, and center.
Real quick, wanted to shout out the people who did the soundtrack, because again, I do think the music is quite good. Riyou, Kinugasa, Takuya, Kobayashi, and Hiromi Mizutani. So good music from them. Special shout out to, I love the song When You're Driving. I don't like driving, but I like the song that plays when you're driving a lot. So that song's quite good. And then the one from the opening cutscene, The Forest and the Goddess. The Woods and the Goddess. Yeah, that one is really, really good. And I think that even in the, I think the only soundtrack stuff that I don't really like is just whatever's going on when you're in those those dungeon sections, but it might just be by association more than anything else. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think the music is all good. Like the chase sequences and everything, they're filled with tension and everything.
Those are good.
I do really think the soundtrack here is excellent. It's just that the way it's used is perhaps the problem for me. But the songs in isolation are really good. And, this is a kind of soundtrack I could listen to by itself, which you definitely can't say of every OST.
I agree with that. I want to give a special shout out or, downvote to that song that plays when you're playing as Emily with Kason chasing the dog.
That song is so weird and out of place.
It's so out of place. It just makes
it's
no sense.
It's funny because that whole fucking scene is out of place.
And it lasts for like 20 minutes or something. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. But yeah, good soundtrack overall. I like it a lot. Yeah. We already talked about some aesthetic things about it. I don't think it's a particularly good-looking game, even by Xbox 360 standards, which is, as we get further and further away, often not a very good-looking generation of games, in my opinion. But even by those standards, this game doesn't look great.
It's not helped by the technical issues either, right?
That's part of it is the technical issues. Part of it is, I think, is budgetary, like they don't have the best facial animations for even like when people are talking and stuff like that. The one thing I do think is really good about this is the town looks pretty good, and characters are memorable in the way that they look. So I don't really think, aside from unfortunately, a couple of the main ladies who are involved in the case, everyone looks pretty distinct. So it's like, they're saying like, oh, we got to go talk to Nick, or this is something going on with Keith. I remember who those people are. I remember what they look like, which is good because there are, a good number of people around the town.
They were very human, weirdly. Like, I know, around this generation, we got a lot better at modeling humans in video games, but I think this game in particular actually, like, for the facial textures and modeling is actually really good. It's when they start animating that it starts getting a bit uncanny, particularly York when he smiles looks a bit strange.
His smile is
it's horrific, yeah. Stuff like that. But the actual,
it looks like Gary's mod smiles,
Yeah, but the actual, models are totally fine, and I think I actually agree with you. A couple of the female characters involved in the case look very similar, and I had a hard time remembering who they were, but most of the main players were very distinct.
Yeah.
The other thing, you said that the town looks pretty good. I actually agree with this. As frustrating it is from a mechanical point of view to get around the town, I actually think the town is very logical and well laid out, and is probably very close to what a town like this would actually look like, with, the industrial sectors being different from the kind of more suburban area where everyone lives and so on and so forth. So I think that this level design and I guess sense of place, this is a pretty immersive world when you look at how it's designed and what it looks like. It's just a pity about the way that they've presented this world to you mechanically.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, this would be a game where I would just drive everywhere and not fast travel if driving wasn't such a chore to do. But it's not a fault of the world itself that I didn't do that. It's a mechanical thing, like you said.
Agreed. If you could drive twice as fast and you had a mini map that was more zoomed out, like most of my problems with the driving would go away. Like, it would still suck to control, but if they just fixed that, I don't think I'd even mind too much, because just the experience of driving through the world would be enough.
Yeah. All right, so we are at the end of the non-spoiler section here, and before we get into housekeeping and stuff like that, we want to get into something I think might be a little bit interesting with this game, which is what kind of person we would recommend play Deadly Premonition. So, the guests always start. So, guys, whoever wants to go first, what type of gamer, I suppose, would you recommend play this game?
I would probably recommend this game to people who don't play a lot of video games more than I would recommend a lot of the core gaming audience, because I think a lot of the problems are to do with the gameplay. Like, the kinds of people who are going to enjoy this are going to be the kinds of people who have lower standards for gameplay, right? Like, they can look past those things and just enjoy the good bits. I was able to enjoy the game overall, I think, maybe. But it's definitely a difficult one to recommend. Like, I don't at all regret playing this game. Like, not one bit. But, I would definitely not recommend it to everyone. You'd have to be the kind of person that engages primarily with the narratives in your video games. People who are very gameplay focused are really going to struggle with this one, I think.
Yeah, so I'd recommend Twin Peaks to two specific kinds of people. The first is people who are big fans of Twin Peaks. Yeah, if you're a Twin Peaks diehard, you will find a lot to get out of this game, because the inspirations are not just surface level, they're literally everywhere, from the character designs to aesthetics to the specifics of the murder case, and even specific details that I won't go into here, but there are very much Easter egg kind of references all over. So I think that if you love Twin Peaks to death, if it's one of your favorite shows ever, then you will be able to push through all of the bad and just really enjoy something that is very much trying to recreate that feeling you had watching this show. The other kind of person is the person who can persist through awful gameplay to get to an enjoyable story. I am not one of these people. Like, for me, if I was not doing this for the show, I wouldn't have lasted 20 minutes with this game. I would have turned it off after the first sequence, because it's that horrifically bad, and it only gets worse from there. But there are a lot of people out there, and that, I don't know who these people are, if you can call them people, who don't have a problem with poor gameplay and are very happy to persist through it for a narrative experience. I call these specimens JRPG fans. So for those people out there is something to enjoy here. And if the story and the kinds of things we've talked about sound intriguing, and you feel you can ignore a poor gameplay experience, there is something worthwhile and valuable for you here. I wouldn't recommend it to myself in a million years, however.
Very on brand to get in a dig on JRPGs there.
I'm sure your core audience will love that, Dave.
Yeah, I personally loved it too, as a person who loves JRPGs. But I think there's a line, right? So like I'm a person who, like, I can definitely get through mediocre gameplay if the story is really good. So like, even in a lot of my favorite games, the gameplay is like fine, not great, not, tickling my strategy brain, thinking of something like, I love Final Fantasy VI, but that's not a great gameplay experience. But it's not like a bad gameplay experience there. Deadly Premonition is a bad gameplay experience. Yeah. So I will kind of echo that. Like, I do recommend that people play this simply because there's nothing like it. Like, this is a wholly unique experience. The story is really fun. The protagonist, York, is really good. A lot of the other characters that you meet are compelling and fun to be around as well. It's just like, you have to really put up with just some awful, awful gameplay. And it's a real shame to, I read an article, an interview with the developer from, where was that from? It was in Polygon. So shout out to that article. I'll link it down in the show notes if I remember to. But where they basically said, like, yeah, this was, forced on us, added really late in development. And it's just one of those times where you're like, man, publishers just fucking trust the creators and trust the thing they're making. Like, this game is demonstrably worse because of the amount of combat and gameplay in it. Had it just been gameplay driving around and talking to people and maybe doing like the light, puzzle boss fight every now and then, I think it would have been a much better game. So as far as recommending it goes, you have to be able to get through that. And whether it takes playing it with a friend or, a significant other or something, and laughing at how bad it is at times, or streaming it on Twitch or something like that, or watching a Let's Play. Because, I'm not a person who can get the same experience out of watching a Let's Play as I would playing it, but I know some people do enjoy that. So if that's you, maybe consider doing that instead of playing this. But I do think the game is worth experiencing in some way, just because of how weird and fun and unique it is. And you can tell how much heart is in the parts of the game that the developers wanted to be the game. There's a lot of heart in there.
Yeah, it's a real shame. I can imagine a version of this game that's just utterly incredible, but it is, one that has almost no gameplay.
Yeah, Dave, I love how you say that, because this is a work of passion when you see the parts of the game that the developers care about. And I think that's really important to highlight. There's a lot of games from this era which don't have any soul to them. And say what you like about this game, but it is not a run-of-the-mill game that they've pushed out to make money. The developers here had a very specific vision that they wanted to bring to life.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, it's meaningful and interesting because of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot of games coming out this fall, as as this episode's coming out, that are arguably soulless in some way, and they're as people look toward video games as an investment more than a creative outlet. Some people do, and if those more money focused things are forced on the people making the games, like in Deadly Premonition, we end up with tarnished works of art, which I think is what Deadly Premonition ends up being for me. It's really weird. There's a lot of this game that I really like, and when we get in the spoiler section, we'll just talk about the story, where a lot of the stuff that I like lives, but the act of playing the game was not enjoyable for a lot of it, just because of how bad the combat is. So it's one that if you ask me, do you like Deadly Premonition? The answer is definitively yes. I like this game a lot. But did I like playing it for a lot of the time? Absolutely not. So it's a really qualified recommendation if you are trying to get people to play this. There's a lot of asterisks on there to just be like, oh yeah, by the way, this is weird, this is terrible, this is odd. Just, if you can push through it, I think it's worth it.
Yeah.
All right. So a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the spoiler section in the episode here. First things first, want to talk about retrospectives. So as always, I'll turn the floor over to the guests to talk about the thing that they make. And retrospectives happens to be a podcast that I really enjoy. So tell people about it, please.
Thanks, Dave. So basically, James and I are the host of the Retrospectives podcast, and what we do each and every episode is that we review classic games that are at least 15 years old from a modern perspective. What that means is that we're seeking to review and understand and discuss these games without any nostalgia or without taking into context the times in which it was created. This is a very harsh standard of criticism, and we acknowledge that because it doesn't take into account, technological developments or the restrictions the developers are working under, or even improved understandings of design principles. But what we have discovered over the 5 years or so of doing the show is that just because a video game is old doesn't mean that it's bad or lesser than its contemporaries. And just because it's old, it doesn't mean that it's better. In most cases, video games are art, and we should be able to evaluate art side by side by other games. So a lot of the time we play these old games and we absolutely trash them and have a horrible time. But we have discovered that in a lot of instances, what people might think of as outdated design principles are not outdated at all, and in many ways are actually superior or produce a superior experience to games that come out today. An example of that I would give is the old stealth games like Thief 1 and Thief 2. These are games that don't have markers telling you where to go. They're games where the maps you have are often incomplete because they're hand-drawn and you have to take your own notes. There are no objective logs. However, the experience of exploring a level in Thief as an underpowered thief with no easy way to kill people, with the world against you, and with limited tools to go through them, is not a game that is worse than Dishonored or a game that is worse than Prey or Deus Ex, the modern Deus Ex games. It's simply a very different and interesting kind of experience in its own right. So, yeah, it's a game where we explore old games for better or worse and have a discussion on whether they're still worth playing today. And that's how I'd sum up our show. Anything to add, James? Or did I nail it?
No, I think that's pretty accurate. One thing that I've enjoyed about our show, like, consistently over the years is that we tend to have very different opinions on the same game. And even often when we like the same game, it'll often be for very different reasons. So I think our ability to approach a review from two completely different angles lets us land in the middle more often than not, where I think if you listen to some shows that have a few hosts with similar viewpoints, you kind of end up with more skewed reviews, whereas I think attacking it from different angles gives you a better holistic, understanding of the game that's being reviewed.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like, for example, James is a JRPG fan, and I absolutely loathe them. But that just means that when we tackle games of that genre, it's all the more interesting because you get those conflicting perspectives. And the different things that we appreciate about games makes the discussion all the richer, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's a really good show. I listen to it every time one pops up on there. And listening to you guys talk about some games has inspired me to play some things like the Pathologic 2 in particular is one I'm currently playing as we're recording. So look forward to that in the future.
That game's amazing.
You have no idea how excited I am for that episode, man. Like, Pathologic 2 is truly an incredible game. I have not ever really played a game that pushes resource management to its limits in the way that Pathologic 2 does. Mm. And every time I play another game with resource management, it always feels like it comes up short.
And just the amount of opportunity cost decisions you have to make, like the map is so open and you could have so many different, approaches to getting through the week or whatever. It's amazing.
Yeah. So, spoiler alert, I'm enjoying it. I'm pretty early on, but I'm enjoying it so far. But all this to say, I really enjoy what you guys do on the show. And the standard that you guys put on it is really interesting because most retro-focused podcasts do try to get into the context of the time. And I'm not one of the people who does that. I'm not really able to. I either enjoy my experience with something or I don't. I can't adjust it based on context that is not here in 2024 anymore. But I've arrived at the same conclusion, and this is something that I might get a discussion episode on sometime in the future, which is that same idea that you talked about, where it's like, I really do think that games don't necessarily age well or age poorly. It's just the really good stuff has always been good, and it's just different than the way things are done right now. Stuff from the late 80s or early 90s with really great game design is still going to have really great game design today. It's just maybe that's not how we're doing it today.
Yeah, the thing that I think we've gotten a lot better on over years is quality of life inclusions, accessibility controls, that kind of thing.
100%, yeah.
Yeah, things like, and technical visuals, like we mentioned, this PS3 generation maybe has probably aged the poorest, in my opinion, in terms of visuals. Like, even the old I still think Metal Gear Solid 1 looks pretty cool. And games like that, whereas I don't think that anything from the PS3 generation really holds up other than something like Shadow of the Colossus, for example, that has great art direction.
I think one of the coolest things about the indie scene, and I absolutely adore indie gaming, is that I think that it understands this principle with all the spiritual successes that have come out to those old games. Example of that would be Signalis. Signalis is a game that is heavily inspired, I think, more specifically by Silent Hill, but with a good dose of Resi thrown in there. And that's a game that understands that the limited resources and tone of the Silent Hill series is something worth preserving and continuing to explore. Whereas if you look at what, horror games were doing throughout the early to late 2000s and early 2010s, we weren't really seeing games in that vein anymore. So I always also like to shout out the indie scene, because in the indie scene, you kind of get recreations or versions of appreciation of classic game design.
Yeah. Signalis was a favorite of mine. It was a really fun podcast to record too in October of 2023. So if anyone out there hasn't listened to that one, that was a fun one, real fun one to get in the spoiler section and just kind of like unload all of our theories about what the fuck's going on in that game. But good times.
The number of video essays I've seen on Signalis, man, it's outrageous.
Absolutely, yeah. So I will put a link to Retrospectives down in the show notes so everyone can come check it out. It's a really good show. Has my recommendation, and again, I do appreciate the unique approach to how you view the games and how you critique them. And it's always intelligent conversations. And even the episodes where you're like really negative about a game, I don't come out of it feeling like, if it's a game that I like in particular, I don't come out of it feeling like my intelligence is insulted for liking the game or something. It's just very well explained perspectives here. So,
thanks,
stuff.
Dave. Very kind of you to say so, man.
Yeah,
Cheers.
absolutely. So again, down in the show notes, people can go look out for retrospectives. For this podcast, you can support the show the same ways as always, patreon.com/realdavejackson. If you want to give a little bit of money each month, you can participate in polls like the one that Deadly Premonition won. Again, that's why it's on the podcast, is it won one of those polls. So that's Patreon, non-money ways to support the show. Ratings and reviews are super helpful. That will help people find this episode. You can join the Discord server and join the conversation about York and Zach and the mystery this week, as well as just a fun community of people to chat with. Always good to have good places on the internet to go hang out. I think our Discord server is one of those. And last but not least, I do another podcast called a Top 3 podcast, where if you like, you can go listen to top 3 lists, draft episodes. It's a comedy show. It's much different from this show. So if you think I have the capacity to be funny or surround myself with funny people, that's another podcast to check out. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, it is full spoiler time for Deadly Premonition. All right, while people are filtering out before spoilers come, I want to give some quick shout outs to people who help support the show over on Patreon. Big shout out to Chris Nelson, the Top 3 podcast crew, Chris Copleen, Eric Guess, Rick Firestone, Nick Ficori, Jill, Jeff, formerly Jerf, Kieran, Soccer, Cupcake, Kyle, Christian S., Matt aka Stormageddon, JD, Doug Leaf, Jason Emery, Brian Skirsha, Randall, Jake Martin, Jenny E., and many more. Thank you all so much for your support. It means the world to me, and if anyone out there listening wants to be like them, once again, patreon.com/realdavejackson is the best way to support the show. Now, let's get on to spoilers for Deadly Premonition. All right, we're back, and it's full spoiler time for Deadly Premonition. And as always, it's not a beat-by-beat plot walkthrough, so we're going to spoil things that happen late in the game very soon. So again, if you don't want to be spoiled on who the killer is in Deadly Premonition and things like that, please jump out, play the game, or, well, I guess if you don't want to be spoiled, you do want to play the game. So yeah, go do that. Okay, so let's talk about the case and just broadly our experience going through the story, who we thought was the killer, stuff like that. I'll say for me personally, there are a couple of big things that I caught a little ways into the game that kind of gave away where the story was going, not necessarily who the killer was, although they do kind of tell you who the killer was very early in the game if you put all your stock into what York's coffee is doing, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think they did a reasonable job of throwing red herrings into the mix. Like, I think the take off your shirt section was good. I thought that the coffee thing, the fact that there ends up being sort of multiple, perpetrators here in a sense, kind of distracts your attention a little bit. I was convinced after Becky got murdered that York or Zach was the killer, because you go through that really long section that at the time you think is probably happening in York's head to some degree, and it could conceivably be him doing the murder while tripping out and not knowing about it, stuff like that. Yeah. For me, I think after Diane is killed, it became very obvious who the Raincoat killer was, because there was only one other person there who could have done it. But up until that point, I thought they were doing a reasonable good job of smoke and mirrors.
I think I must be thicker than both of you because I didn't really catch on to who it was until the game told me. Maybe that's one of the reasons I enjoy these crime shows so much, that I'm the kind of person who does just get pulled along with the thread of the story, and when the reveals come, I'm always shocked.
Yeah, so I caught on to one particular thing, which is that basically the biggest players in the story, with one notable exception, are all at the top of the alphabet. So Anna, Becky, Carol, Diane, and Emily all get killed. A, B, C, D, E. Forrest is the killer mastermind behind it all, and George is the Raincoat killer. So that's all in a row.
And then York and Zach at the end.
That's right, yeah. So if you look at the credits of the game, there is one character for every letter. And so at the end is York Morgan and Zach Morgan. So what kind of keyed me into that, I noticed the names, and that kind of led me on the belief that Emily's in trouble before the story started to put Emily in danger, which I thought was really good if you catch on to that, because that's about the time that York and Emily are starting to get closer to each other. So I thought that was really good. But to kind of be on your side here, Patrick, I did not know that George was going to be the Raincoat killer, because I think that, looking back, they have that scene where they have to take their shirts off and show York their back, and George's back is all fucked up. But then I forgot about it because, someone died in a horrific manner pretty soon after that. So, and George was obviously George did it, but George had a better alibi or something at that time. So I was really along for the ride in here. And I had kind of not disregarded, but forgotten until York brings it up later that his coffee had the initial FK earlier. And there's just too much going on with plants to not implicate Kaysen.
Well, that's one of the weird things, right? Kaysen has that little red sapling with him all the time, and York doesn't comment on it at all. Yeah. And it's very bizarre that York doesn't bring any attention to that whatsoever, to the point that it doesn't make any sense. So that really confused me. I'm like, oh, it must be nothing. But with the prime thing in the story, the prime piece of evidence being the red seeds from these, bright fucking red trees. He goes to the graveyard and finds the trees that the seeds come from.
and Kaysen is carrying around this red sapling all the time. Like, I think it's part of his character model even. Like, maybe one time you see him without it, which is goofy. But that is a kind of an oversight. I agree.
Yeah, I think this game suffers from the same thing a lot of mysteries do, is that if you are well familiar with the genre, you know that, like, the writers have to follow a pretty strict set of rules in order to write a good story, which is the killer effectively has to be someone that you interact with a lot. If it's somebody you've never seen before or never heard of before, that's not a good story. So it has to be someone close to the main character, always, and there's really not a lot of people here that it could be. Like, it basically, in my head, it was either going to be Emily, George, or Thomas from the very beginning. And I was even kind of suspicious of the old lady at the diner, at the hotel. But it had to be one of those characters, like, guaranteed. So, and I don't really think that you can get away with not having it be a character like that. The only way you can do this is to make it so that there is a huge number of characters, like, closely involved with the player at all times.
Yeah, but the close cast in this game is too tight. You're right. There are way too many people for that.
Yeah.
I had a feeling it might be some kind of conspiracy thing. I thought it might have been, I thought that it might have been working on the assumption that you just assumed that the Raincoat Killer was a man. So I'm like, maybe it's Diane, or maybe it's one of these other female characters, or maybe there's multiple people who don the identity of the Raincoat Killer, because, it's just a costume at the end of the day. In the end, it ended up being something a bit more mundane, I guess. Not uninteresting, but I thought there might have been something more complex going on. Instead, as you guys said, it ends up revolving a lot more personally around York and the cast of characters he's interacting with the most.
Yeah, it gets like complicated and weird and like really into supernatural territory, but that's super late and really only involves a couple of characters when it all comes down to it. So it's not like this big conspiracy. I want to go back to something James had said, which is that you thought York was the killer for part of it. And I thought that too for a little bit, because I wondered where all these zombies were coming from in those combat sections. So I was starting to think, like, is York having some weird mental thing where he perceives the world like this and he's actually killing these people?
Yeah.
But that kind of went away partly because you come to out of these and there are not dozens of dead townsfolk around. But also, I think the story started to really push in those other directions. And by the time Thomas goes off the deep end, you kind of really get the sense, like, okay, it's definitely not me. It's one of these other people.
Did you guys have that moment when you were controlling Emily and she enters that world? It's like,
yeah,
when she enters that world, it's like, holy shit, this is all real, actually. Like, because up until that point, it's like, it's not very, like, clear what's going on with that world at all. But the second she sees one, it's like, oh, okay, something is actually happening here.
But it's really weird because, like, if it's real, and it is real because multiple characters experience it, nobody talks about it really, except for when you go talk to Harry and he tells you that story of what happened, with the army and the poison gas, however many years ago. But, like, if this is happening with the regularity for, like, I'll just say it this way. If it's happening for everybody, then you would think that people would talk about it, unless it happens so often that people are like, yeah, we just hunker down in our houses. It's kind of like tornadoes in Ohio. Like, we don't talk about every tornado watch that happens because they happen often enough. It might be like that, but it did feel weird to me that, like, once I realized this is real, why is nobody commenting on this?
Because it's a gameplay contrivance is
well,
why.
The thing is, I think what it's implying is basically Kaysen and whatever is controlling him comes from that red world, and effectively when the characters are getting closer to discovering the truth, they kind of get thrown in there as a way of trying to kill them off. So I don't think that anybody other than York is going there for, the vast majority of the game until right at the end when Emily is getting close to capturing Thomas. She gets sent in there. So yeah, I don't think that it's too much of a problem in that sense, and I would understand why. Like, York already doesn't like talking about Zack to people. I could completely understand him not wanting to explain this thing in particular to others.
He'd have to explain to his bosses why he expended 300 rounds of submachine gun ammo, though, right?
That's true, yeah.
To me, this isn't actually that deep. It's just a stupid gameplay contrivance that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Probably
that's where I land on this.
Probably like one of you said, if the truth of the development of this game is that this combat stuff was added really late and maybe the voice acting was all wrapped up, they couldn't have a conversation about it unless they did it with all text or something. And maybe they didn't have time to animate more conversations. Who knows?
I do think that conceptually, without the publisher meddling, the concept of the red and the white rooms probably existed during development, at least. Because those sections at like when you go to sleep and you play, eventually you realize you're playing as Zack, who's trapped in those rooms the whole time. Yeah, I think
this is
before.
Something that's also taken from Twin Peaks, by the way. This concept. I mean, you guys are probably familiar with the famous Red Room scene in Twin Peaks,
no,
with the dwarf dancing and speaking in reverse.
No,
or maybe you've seen the Simpsons episode, the Who Shot Mr. Burns episode, the riffs off it.
Oh, yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah, I have not. But I did hear someone in the Twitch chat did say when one of these Red Room things came up, they're like, oh, yep, this is Twin Peaks too. So, yeah.
Yeah. Watch Who Shot Mr. Burns. I'll teach you everything you need to know.
So I did not understand what these red and white rooms were all about. So do either of you know?
So the Red Room seems to be, but they both seem to be some kind of alternate, like, overlapping reality with our own. I believe whatever monster is possessing or using Kaisen comes from there and is trying to manipulate our world. That's how it felt to me. I read some developer interviews. Apparently Kaisen's dog is like the mastermind behind everything. And one of the reason I bring this up is because earlier we mentioned how annoying it is that you can't zoom the map out. Did you guys notice that if you look at the map, it looks like a dog?
I did see someone mention that. I didn't notice it myself.
Yeah.
Weird.
So I think they intentionally stopped you zooming out for the spoiler, you know what I mean? Which results in an absolutely horrific gameplay experience. But yeah, just completely ridiculous.
Oh my god, it does look like a dog. Look at that. Okay, that's weird.
It actually when I read that, I got kind of mad because I was like, you're telling me that you made my life hell just so you could have this stupid dog picture on the map.
I actually like this a lot. I like the idea of the mastermind behind Kaisen a lot less now than I did when I thought this is something that's completely out of the picture. Like it's on a scale much bigger than this. So it's just doing this through Kaisen.
Yeah, because if you go around the town, like one of the last scenes of the game has the dog following you with that little Kaisen doll in its mouth. And those dolls are like everywhere throughout the town if you're looking for them. And I think it's like heavily implied through the historical pictures that there's like multiple Kaisens throughout the world, like enacting the will of that thing that you shoot at the end.
I thought it was the one Kaisen and he just traveled around.
Yeah, I thought that it was just, this Kaisen is immortal or something, and Kaisen's always been here, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be that thing where there's this like otherworldly entity, it's like 4-dimensional and it's intersecting the world at different points at the same time. But yeah, it kind of didn't work out to me very well at the end. I didn't find the mastermind's like, he's basically I'm doing it for the lulz tier villain. Is very not compelling in my opinion.
Well, there's a sadism to him, right? And I think that this is something we kind of mentioned in our Eternal Darkness episode. The thing that stops this game truly becoming Lovecraftian is the, I guess, sadism of these villains, the fact that they seem to delight in human suffering. Whereas I think with Lovecraftian horror, there's no delighting in human suffering. It's kind of like an indifference to human suffering. Or an indifference to humanity and our understanding of concepts in general. So, and I've always found that this expression of Lovecraftian horror is less interesting than when it is, I guess, power and concepts beyond our frail human understanding.
Yeah. So this is a good point just to for anyone who's listening who did not play the game. What you learn is, we've already said, Kaysen is the killer. He's the big guy who's kind of following you around, helping out from time to time. He's a traveling tree salesman. He's
played for comic relief mostly. In the story.
He's a friendly guy. He's got a Dalmatian that goes around with him, and he kind of helps out. He helps babysit the kids when their parents are working. The twins. And so you eventually learn he is not the Raincoat killer. That's George, the sheriff. But Kaysen is the one masterminding the whole thing. And those other murders across the country with those red seeds, that was also Kaysen's doing, whether it's indirectly or directly, who knows. So you find out that Kaysen has kind of always been in the town. He was there on this night when the army was spraying this like hallucinogenic gas around town that made everyone kind of go crazy, and that birthed the folklore of the Raincoat killer on rainy nights. And just want to point out, there's that section late in the game when you play as the Raincoat killer, going through the town trying to get to the clock tower. That is just dog shit. It's so bad.
Bad. Yeah, not as bad as the final boss fight, but it's pretty bad.
Yeah, it's just like, so you're playing as the Raincoat killer, you have an axe. What is the least interesting thing we could have you do? Go through a maze on a time limit. That's what this is.
Talking about the boss fights, I actually thought that Thomas's boss fight was okay. Like, it wasn't, I wouldn't call it good, but it was like fine, where the rest of the gameplay is atrocious. George's was awful, I thought, and Kaysen's first phase was good, I thought. The rest of it was atrocious.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Thomas one. So Thomas is in the clock tower on like the giant gears kind of going around. You're playing as Emily during this part.
Yeah.
I thought that one was fine. It was like, again, this is a terrible third-person combat system, so this fight is like as good as this combat system would ever allow a boss fight to be, I think. But I didn't hate it.
My problem is that I don't really think that a game like this should really have boss fights.
Yeah.
And this is, once again, it feels very gamey that we have these sequence of big boss fights at the end of the game. It's like, why do we have boss fights? Because it's a video game and it needs boss fights. Yeah. I found them unsatisfying, not just mechanically, but just because I don't really... this isn't the part of the game I enjoy. And shooting an enemy's weak spot X times while pressing a quick time event to dodge an attack isn't... It isn't enjoyable in and of itself, and thematically, I don't think it ties in with the rest of the feeling that the game is going for. So, I'm very low on these. I think that the game would be better without boss fights altogether.
Yeah, I don't disagree for sure. It's just on the spectrum of this game's boss fights. Thomas's was at least somewhat interesting. The arena that you're in is fun, and same with the final boss fight, where in phase 1, he's kind of swinging around in that theater. I thought that was, again, like on the Deadly Premonition curve, it was okay. It takes too long, but it was okay. And it's like really easy from that. George's boss fight is like horrifically bad.
Yeah, awful. Really, really terrible.
Yeah.
I had to look. I didn't understand what I was supposed to do in the last phase. Like, he healed himself like 6 times before I gave up and looked up what I had to do, which was shoot the axe that he throws at you. I was just dodging out of the way like I had been for the first 2 phases.
Yeah, for and the entire game before that too.
Yeah. And they don't indicate at all that you need to shoot it. I don't know.
Yeah. The only percentage points of enjoyment I got from that boss fight is that George turns into this weird, like, anime villain, basically, for lack of a better descriptor in there, with like his visual design. Like, he gets this long, flowing white hair, and like the facial hair gets like that too. It's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah.
Can I ask you guys, how did you feel, and this is kind of dovetailing to story a bit, but how did you feel about George as a character in general? Because I have to say, I found that his performance was a little underwhelming, a little understated. I guess what I was hoping for was like more of a Tommy Lee Jones kind of character, but instead he's a bit too monotone and passive for what he ends up becoming. I don't know if you guys felt similar, but for me, I could see what they're trying to go for with George, but in the end, I didn't find him to be a very compelling character.
I tend to agree. I think they did some good things with him. Like, one of my favorite moments in the entire game is when York suggests that they should go fishing to get the next clue. And Emily just thinks that's completely ridiculous. And up until this point, George has also sided with Emily for every single time York has been ridiculous. But this one time, he's like, you know what? We're just doing it. No questions. So good.
He says something like waterfalls are a great source of Zen energy as well. Like some completely off-kilter spiritual reason.
That seemed like just a weird, like, we have this tone in this game. Characters say weird things, and it's George's turn to say something weird.
Now, that is very Twin Peaks. Like, that is like bang on what a character would say in Twin Peaks.
There we go.
One of the most famous scenes in Twin Peaks is Cooper explaining their methodology for how they're going to find the killer. And then he turns this whiteboard around and he says, but before we do that, we need to talk about Tibet. And then he goes into a 2-minute explanation of Tibet and their spirituality and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there we go. I like George as a character. I thought, like, now looking back on it, I think that George is not making decisions for himself. So I think that he pushes back, like, when he can push back. But he does have to play the sheriff, like, and cede jurisdiction to the FBI when it's time. So, like, I think that's why he doesn't really fight back as much as you would think he would if he's trying to cover up his identity. I think he just kind of like lets York go because he figures at some point they're going to take him out because that's what they do. The revelation that he's the Raincoat killer, I didn't expect it until it became like clear that he was the only person that really could be doing it. And then the way that his story ties in with what Kaysen is doing, I thought was pretty interesting. But I liked the performance for George, and I liked just how just grumpy he is most of the time. I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed him a lot. I really liked that scene in the bar where he opens up to you a little bit, and I thought that it actually it sort of felt like it took away from his character a little when they... Like, I wish he wasn't the Raincoat killer. Like, I wish it had been a different character, because, like, that whole time where he transformed into that ridiculous monster and explained everything, it just... I don't know, something about it didn't sit right with me. It didn't feel real. It felt like they had made a new character out of this other character who had, up until this point, been pretty enjoyable. And it's like less me feeling shocked that a character I like was the killer, and less that it just didn't really click for me when they did the reveal.
Yeah.
See, I can't help but compare like that monologue to monologues from No Country for Old Men, or the monologue from Jaws, or these other TV show monologues from Westworld. These 10 out of 10 TV shows where someone kind of like explains themselves some dark part of their history, and I feel like George's just comes up a bit short. And I understand that's like an insanely high standard to compare it to, but this, like the storytelling in this and the way it's presenting itself, it's almost like a TV show to me. So yeah, a high standard of comparison, but to me it just all fell a little bit short.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the other stuff with George's character is really interesting, but that monologue where, correct me if I'm wrong, but he basically just says like, these red seeds are going to turn me into a god and I'm going to have unlimited power, which when you learn about his backstory and stuff, you could understand why he would want to be more powerful. But at the end of the day, character who wants to become a god is just not interesting to me anymore as a motivation, even putting aside like, once you learn out learn what happened to his mom and why he wouldn't let you come in the house earlier and stuff like that. Like that stuff is all interesting. And George's, didn't even mention George's sex club with the people around town. Like,
yeah,
that stuff is interesting. Like, parts of his character. It's just where his arc ends is the least interesting way it could have ended, I think.
See, I would have much preferred if the reason he was killing people was because he had this misplaced sense of justice or something, like he was trying to protect the town from these people who were, planning to do awful things, that kind of thing. Like if he thought he was in the right, but he's not really like that. He's like very hard to empathize with at all. Once he does the reveal, like you can kind of feel bad for him for his upbringing and that kind of thing, but the way, like the hard U-turn he takes, because of the things Kaysen told him, are kind of ridiculous.
He doesn't fit the serial killer mold, right? Like, I can't remember the name of the show, but there was a show not too long ago which was like, it was an investigation into the formation of the FBI and how they stopped, the serial killer. I don't know if you guys know what I'm talking about.
No idea.
Anyway, it's a recreation of like the formation of psychological profiling of serial killers. It's very good. But serial killers basically follow a particular mold in most cases, and him wanting to be a god is not what serial killers are about ever, really. They have much deeper issues, and that aspect was just missing from this criminal investigation.
I think that those, like, there could have been deeper issues explored with George, with how, just Kaysen ruined his life in a lot of ways, and how he's clearly like had this unrequited love for Emily. And, we get into more, I think, traditional psychological things about serial killers and their quest for, control and power over people, but like on a smaller scale than I'm going to eat these seeds and become a god. Like, I ultimately think that like the supernatural turn in this game is fun and interesting. It's just not really interesting with George in particular, in my opinion.
Yeah, like I could get behind, like I actually think I would have preferred it if they had never explained the supernatural stuff, and like the Raincoat Killer had sort of figured something out about it in order to use it for his own personal gain. I could have gotten behind that. I think, like, the combination of having Kaysen doing it for the, like, sadistic lulz or whatever, plus a character I really liked kind of U-turning, it kind of made the ending, like, not very enjoyable to me compared to the start of the game. Like, I thought they did an amazing job, hyping up the mystery and confusing you and having weird events happen. And then the way it ties together, it just fell a little flat to me.
I think before we talk about the end and how everything ties together, I want to kind of go back and talk about what Kaysen's doing, and then talk about York and Zack a little bit, and then we'll tie it all together with how the story finishes. So Kaysen is just kind of like going through time with these saplings, and what he's doing, what you get the sense that he's doing through a lot of these is some kind of like ritual thing where, so what I didn't quite understand is like he did this ritual thing with George's mom, with York's mom, and with Emily, where he like implants the trees like in their womb or in their stomach or something like that. And we talked about horror earlier. There's some pretty intense body horror with this stuff, which I think is real freaky. Plant and human body horror is especially like creepy to me personally. So this is one of those for sure. I didn't quite understand or unless that's George's like doing ritual killings to try and make Kaysen or this like god happy or something like that. The other 4 murders were very ritualistic with these seeds and cutting the tongues out and stuff like that. I didn't quite get what was going on with those.
What I think's happened is that Kaysen has told George he needs to do this in order to get power
in this way.
Whereas for Kaysen, the rituals he's performing are about spreading his influence throughout the world.
Yeah,
because I think that each time he does one of these rituals, a new one of these trees comes into existence, and the more of the trees that exist throughout the world, the more he is exuding his influence on the world.
My understanding is that that there is a progenitor red tree, like that's the source of all this. That's basically trying to spread itself through our world as well. To me, the villains actually seems more like a metaphor for male sexual violence more than anything. Like, we have a lot of them hyper-focusing on Emily in particular. A lot of the murders are against women, and the trees get planted in pretty private places, that kind of thing. And it all, there's a lot of sexual undertones with the dungeons and that kind of thing. It seems pretty clear, like metaphorically, that that's what the developers were going for with this sort of thing.
Yeah, that's all the profiling scenes are, sexual. Before the murder starts happening, they start as a sexual encounter, right?
Yeah, basically.
Pretty much all of them, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
So, if it made me, some of those scenes made me feel pretty damn uncomfortable, particularly the one with Kaysen and Emily at the end. That was probably the most uncomfortable I felt in the entire game.
Honestly, it almost felt unnecessary to me. It felt a bit gratuitous, actually. That's the only part where I felt it went over the top a little bit.
Interesting. So it is gratuitous, especially when, like, if you do it, you rip the tree out of Emily, or she rips it out of herself, sorry. But I think that scene serves the other purpose, which is to put York in the situation to make the choice that his father couldn't make earlier. That's why they set that situation up.
Oh, that was Emily. So annoying. I intentionally made the wrong choice to see what would happen, and it just plays a game over and then reloads you to that point, even though the game specifically says it's your choice. They're all correct, and then there's a wrong choice.
I think York is a wuss, and he should have shot her in the head immediately. Yeah. If it was me, I would have just been bang, done and dusted.
So that's kind of an option, but that's not how it plays out. So a little bit of backstory here. We learn that when York was a kid, his dad killed his mom and then killed himself. And this was a really traumatic event, and it ended up causing the split in personalities between York and Zack. They're the same person. And real quick, before I go any further, I thought for the longest time, and I still kind of think, that Zack is me, the person playing the game. Did you guys get that sense?
Yeah, I felt that too.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Cool. So, and then even when it's revealed later that Zack is another part of York's personality, or Zack is the original one. York is the kind of stand-in that's like facing the world so Zack doesn't have to, or something like that. I still got the sense that like I am controlling whatever the personality in the background is, basically. So when they switch and York switches to his brilliant white hair at the end of the game, I am now controlling York, and Zack is the character that I'm controlling. So this scene here, it's revealed later on that Kaysen was there, and Kaysen had done this same kind of tree impregnation on York's mother, and his father could not shoot her in time for like the horrific death where like the tree grows out, the body shrivels up and stuff. The same thing happened to George's mom when you go in his basement. And then at the end, Kaysen does this to Emily, and she's still alive, and York has the chance, and the flashback plays, and this is where you learn about all of this. York, Zack, has the chance to do what his father could not. And the thing that you should do is, I think you should point the gun at Emily, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
If you try to point the gun at Kaysen, you get a game over. If you point the gun at yourself, you also get a game over. And in both cases, they say, and I forget if it's York or Zack at this point, but they say something like, we can do better. We can make a better choice. Let's try that again. Right?
Yeah.
So you point the gun at Emily. She rips the sapling out and she dies. So, you were not able to save her. And I thought it was a, interesting choice to have Emily die here as part of the end of the game. I really thought we were working toward like York makes the right choice, or York is able to find a way to, save her in some way, but no.
I saw a lot of people talking about this online after I finished the game, but you effectively lose everything at the end of the game. Like, you lose what makes Greenvale Greenvale. Like, all of the characters who were important to Zack basically die, including York himself.
Mm-hmm.
And then even in the very end, we lose Zack, like, to old age. Once the game ends, basically everything that I liked about the game was gone, And I read another interview by the developer saying that this was intentional, that they wanted to have an ending that made people feel a sense of loss, not just for a particular character, but for the game itself. And while I think they were successful, I don't know, how much better that actually makes it as a title.
It's interesting you say that, because I felt that when it was over. Like, after you finish the game, you can keep playing and go do side quests, but kind of like you said, all my favorite characters were dead. So, except for Keith, I could go talk to Keith, hear more ghost stories from him.
And the guy that talks in rhyme.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I quite liked the ending with everyone dying. I like the idea of like this epilogue. You think that you've saved the day, and then there's, well, actually you haven't. It's a common trope, but it's one that I always enjoy. And I liked the nihilism of everyone dying. I kind of like depressing, tragic endings like that. But I wasn't as invested in the world and characters as you guys were, because the whole thing, it just didn't speak to me on such a deep level because it was so fundamentally silly. And I think that wrapping everything up with these stupid boss fights made me even less engaged with the world and characters than was previously possible. So I like the ending, but I can understand the sense of loss that you guys felt.
So I wasn't like emotionally affected. It was more like reacting to body horror, and then especially when she rips the sapling out, I was like, Jesus fucking Christ, that's how Emily goes out? Okay.
Honestly, Emily gains points as being pretty badass for me.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Beat one of the bosses and doing that was like pretty good for a character.
Yeah. I want to go back to talking about the final boss with Kason for a couple of reasons. First of all, I already said the part where you're fighting Kason in the theater is goofy, but like, you know, as far as boss fights in Deadly Premonition, I didn't mind it. The chase down the stairs is,
so bad.
Like I said earlier, one of the worst things I've ever had to do in a video game. It's so bad that you know these sections are bad when like I'm not holding the controller the regular way. I'm like wiggling the stick as fast as I can with my right hand, like over the stick. Yeah. And then like, if I have to press a button, I'll get over and try and press it really fast. Like if you have people doing that, don't fucking do this.
Yeah, I was doing the same thing. I don't know how you're meant to use your left thumb to actually wriggle it. It doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah. I was using like the heel of my right hand.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the third phase where Kason is this like giant monster. The first part of it, I didn't mind. I thought it was just, you know, like cool visually. Kason's giant. You're fighting him. The second phase is again, the worst. For those who didn't play it, Kason in the first phase is holding this doll of himself, and that's the only thing that can take damage. So you have to shoot the doll. It kind of sucks because aiming sucks, and the lock-on does not work in this part. You have to manually aim it, unless you're really close. I don't know. But anyway, in the second phase, he puts the doll in his overall pouch, and so you can't shoot it. And so you have to bait out an arm slam, jump on his arm, climb up on his shoulders, and shoot the doll from his shoulders down into the overalls pouch, which sounds cool, and it like kind of is visually, but you get a short time to shoot it, and if you miss, he throws you down, fully heals, and then you have to do the first phase all over again, and it's absolute dog shit.
And it's a super awkward angle, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not like an easy shot, and he's kind of moving a bit, so you don't always have a clear shot.
And even if he wasn't, aiming in Deadly Premonition is dog shit, so... Yep. I got so mad when he threw me down and healed fully, and I was like, okay, here's another 5 minutes of my life doing the first phase of this boss fight. I was legitimately angry.
I failed it twice. Both times I ran up his shoulder and then aimed at the doll like I was supposed to, and just he moved in such a way that his chin like covered it every time I shot, like multiple times, and then had to do the whole... And it's so slow. If the game let me do it quickly, if I was more skilled, that would be fine. But it's just a lot of like standing still doing nothing while he doesn't actually do any attacks until finally, like, he'll slam his fist on the ground and then you can finally try again. It's just such a waste of time.
Yep.
Yeah, hate it.
It's dog shit. And then it's followed up by something that will always I will always like this, but it's real weird. So after you shoot it, Kason is like going through the death throes and stuff like that, and he yells, "Why do you cause me pain?" And York does the action movie dramatic one-liner, camera zooms in on his face as he points the gun, and he says, "Because you don't understand humans," and then shoots him. And that made me laugh.
And then he turns around and walks towards the camera as he's exploding. It's so...
But you're in this supernatural void. Like, where's he walking?
I could not believe that when I saw it. I'm like, what is even happening right now? What tone are you going for?
You knew when they were storyboarding this was how it was going to end. It did not matter what the setting was, what the boss fight arena looked like. York was going to turn around and walk toward the camera at the end of it.
Yeah, cool guys don't look at explosions.
Exactly, yeah. But that final phase of that boss fight, it made me so mad. The chase sequence, it made me so mad. It's one of those where, like, I don't know if you guys ever had this experience. This happened to me in Outer Wilds, which is a wonderful, amazing game, and I was so tilted by the act of getting to the ending that while the ending was happening, I was still mad and I couldn't focus. Like, this happened in this game where, like, the ending of this game is really interesting, I think, in like what happens, but I was still like, my blood pressure was still up from that final boss fight because I hated it so much that, like, these things played out in front of my eyes and I wrote them in my notes, but like, I don't feel like I could feel the resolution the way they wanted me to which is, I always hate it when this happens. And it's a video game thing, like unique to video games.
Yeah, I definitely know that feeling. I'm very interested to hear more about that Outer Wilds experience, because that is my favorite game of all time. But maybe we shouldn't because of spoilers.
Yeah,
but
remind me after we're done. Yeah.
Yeah, I know exactly how you feel, that feeling of being tilted off the face of the earth and as a result not being able to actually enjoy the catharsis of actually finishing it.
Yeah. So the end here, you have a cutscene where Zach is getting ready to leave town. And like, again, you can go back out into the town and do more side quests. You can go fishing. You can hang out with Polly in the hotel, whatever you want to do. But eventually, if you drive to the edge of, no, I think it's if you get in the car, they'll ask you, do you want to leave? Or something like that. It's a ring in the parking lot, I think. Anyway, if you choose to leave, you get a cutscene where Zach is leaving town and he looks out in the forest and he sees Emily out there. So he follows her into the forest, and the twins are out there. They give Zach a gift from Emily, and they say that she and Zach's twin are out in the forest. And then you see, I think you see all the dead women and York out in the forest, their spirits or whatever are living out there. This was really weird for me because I thought it was like kind of, romantic in a way that everyone continues their life in this spiritual way at the end of the game. But then it makes me wonder, like, what does this mean for Zach? Like, is it just that Zach is back and Zach can experience the world? Because everyone that he grew to care about died in this story.
But that's the idea, right? It was York who was having all those interactions, and York has passed on with everyone else. So it's the whole idea is that it was York who sacrificed himself and is dead with all the other characters. Zach is now alive and in the real world and can live his own life. That's the way I saw it anyway.
Yeah. But the only thing there is that Zach and York seem to share memories or share experiences. So, because like Zach knows who Emily is, despite York spending all the time with Emily. Like, they might see it as the other person interacting with this person, but it's not like Zach wakes up and he's like, who are all these people? So it's not like that.
There's a bit where York is kind of coming to terms with his feelings about Emily, and he's talking to Zach, and they're talking about competing for her.
Oh, that was great.
So I do think that they are two distinct personalities, or at least that's how the game's trying to present it. I agree with you that it doesn't actually make that much sense, but I think that's what they were going for. Yeah,
for sure. They're definitely two separate parts of the same thing,
psyche or soul,
inhabiting the same body or something like that. And then they're really driving this home with the post-credit scene too, where York and Emily are in a diner. Anna's there, the other murder victims are there, Thomas is there, York and Emily kiss. So it's like you might get the happy ending for them, but again, they're all dead. This is spirit world. Zach is what is Zach going to do? Just go back to work? Is he even going to be a cop?
Yeah. Can he even solve mysteries on his own? Like, was that all York? Yeah.
That would be interesting if Zach... Because Zach, might be answered in the sequel, because Zach's in the sequel.
Yeah. Apparently it's not very good, but, I mean, this game wasn't very good, so...
Exactly. What standard of not very good are we going by here?
What I've heard is that the sequel has a lot of the charm that the first game has. So like the, characters and stuff like that. Gameplay is still dog shit from what I heard. And there's an interesting thing people have said where they don't like the way that the game treats the characters in the second game. And I don't know exactly what they mean, but that's not something I got from the first game here. So interesting. I don't think I'll play the sequel, but who knows?
I kind of want to play it just to see how bad it is, but like at the same time, I think I might just watch a playthrough.
Part of it too is I think the sequel's only on Switch, which is really weird.
Oh no, it must be terrible.
That is bizarre.
Anything else about the plot or like memorable moments in Deadly Premonition?
I guess it's worth bringing up. We've kind of done it, but it's worth bringing up the parts of this game that feel like shit posting, because it's very
It's like
it's
half
very
the
strange.
game.
You're playing through this game, and then every now and then you get this sequence or cutscene where you're like, is this game secretly just a comedy and it's having a joke at my expense?
I think
And
so.
there's one of these very early on where you're sitting at a table with the hotel owner, and the table is like 40 meters long, and you're sitting at opposite ends of the table. And I'm like, what is even happening with this game anymore?
I really like this game's like stupid sense of humor. The next thing that happened after that was that you go to the police station for the first time and Thomas says, I've lost my keys. Can you find my key? And you're like, okay. And you walk into, he's like, the key has a key ring of a squirrel on it.
And it's like a set, the keys that you find these like very similar keys of all these different species of squirrels, and you take it back and Thomas is like, no, this is an eastern striped squirrel. I'm not looking for this. I need, the western black squirrel or whatever.
Yeah,
so
you go through like 8 keys or something.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, I love that though.
Yeah, and they play these the way, like, I think the way that it sells itself so well to me because they play most of these scenes like completely straight for like the majority of them. Like, York is just so confused while he's grabbing those keys and at that dinner table, and every other character is just like acting completely naturally.
Yeah. One scene I just wanted to shout out because I thought it was really funny is when I think is it Diane that's hanging from the ceiling above the statue in the museum, or is that?
Yeah, that part was hilarious.
Yeah, when York jumps off the balcony railing to
so ridiculous
to grab her as she's falling. I love that so much.
Like, what is going on right now?
Yeah, so I think that it's funny. These absolutely ludicrous comedy scenes do succeed in the sense that they add to the weirdness of the of the thing. But it is another culprit of creating this tonal whiplash. And I guess at the end of the day, if you're in for this, you're in for it in a big way, and you'll absolutely adore and love this part of the game.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was like almost my favorite part of the game was this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, but it's very odd.
Or like when York goes fishing for evidence, and you catch some fish or whatever, and then eventually you do pull it out, and everyone's like, just.
I was legitimately like in tears laughing at that sequence from like start to finish. Like, the whole thing starts off with the stupid coffee thing, and then him being like, there's an ad for this fishing spot on this coffee mug. Let's go to this watering hole and go fishing because the evidence will be in there. It's like, and then like you play the fishing mini game, and it's like this game of like slots basically with the most ridiculous character expressions as the slot reels. And then it just works out, and nobody like says anything. They just go along with it.
Yeah, they just kind of like, it's one of those like, oh, York type of moments.
Yeah. Like, things like, you can shave anywhere and York's facial hair will grow, but like, you can shave anywhere there's a tap and water. Like, you'll be in one of those otherworld horror dimensions, and there'll be this fucked up sink filled with nasty shit, and there'll be this like razor icon there, and you can just walk up and shave at this like filth encrusted sink, and he won't even say anything, he'll just do it.
Oh, that reminds me. I spent probably an hour or so with bugs flying around me.
Oh, me too.
Early in the game without realizing why. It's just because it happened in one of the horror levels, and I was like, okay, fine. Like, this is a dirty fucking place. There's bugs flying around. And then like York wakes up the next morning in the hotel and it's still happening. And I was like, what? Is this a bug? A bug. And then I had to go look that up, and it was like, no, you have to change your suit. That's something you do in this game. You change your suits, you get them dry cleaned. Yeah.
It happened to me, like, because I was just changing clothes for the sake of it, for the first, like, half of the game. So the first time I noticed the bugs was in that conversation with George about his backstory when Emily rocks up in the dress. And the whole scene was like ruined because of the bug thing. It was so distracting.
On that note, how funny is it when Emily shows up at his hotel room and he just starts telling her about his mother instead of hooking up with her? I was like, what are you doing? What are you doing? She's turned up at your hotel room late at night. Why do you think she's doing that?
Yeah, that's the part where I was like, earlier, where I was like, I think part of it, it's not that York doesn't care about what people around think about what he's saying. He obviously can't read the room either because of that scene with Emily showing up, where he's like, this is the time to tell about how my mother and father brutally died when I was a little kid. This is the moment. So, goofy ass game. I think this is a good place to call this one. What a ride playing the game, and then a lot to discuss, obviously, with this one, too. I thank you both for taking about 3 hours to talk about it with me.
That's all right.
Well, thank you so much for giving up your Saturday night. We really do appreciate it. I know it's awkward recording with us all the way in Australia, so thank you.
It's no problem.
I'd like to thank, I think, this game has a lot of shit posts, but I think the biggest shit post of all was your Patreon users voting for this game.
Exactly.
I wanted to mention that as well. I looked at the list of the other games. I'm like, oh, these are some high quality games. But no, your patrons went with Deadly Premonition because they're a bunch of trolls.
Honestly, great choice. 10 out of 10.
So for anyone listening, it was Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, System Shock 2, and then Castlevania, Order of Ecclesia, I think it was. And yeah, it's one of those moments, I do the polls, and every now and then, the poll results will be like, oh, my patrons are not picking for the most popular game. They are some real ones. They want a fun podcast episode and a fun experience. And I think, this is one of those where it won pretty convincingly too, as far as I remember. So they knew what they wanted. So shout out to everybody who votes and, supports over on Patreon one more time.
Yeah, in some way I was grateful because we've literally just played through System Shock 2. So it was fun getting to play a fresh game and have a fresh experience.
Well, I don't know about fun, but it was interesting.
Well,
Interesting
for sure. Yeah. So that is the end of the episode. Again, thank you to James and Patrick for joining today. And for everyone listening, a reminder that down in the show notes, you'll find a link to Retrospectives. And again, it's a podcast that I think is worth your time. And for me, that is all to say. But I haven't recorded in a couple weeks. I forget how to end the episodes. So yeah, thank you for listening all the way to the end at about 3 hours. As always, you're my hero, and tune in next week for the next game to come out of the backlog.
Feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
and Jacob McCoy.
With many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. all with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers and happy gaming.
Do you have a gaming subscription service like Xbox Game Pass or a crazy backlog and don't know what to play next? Well, 1H1D might be for you. Join me, Chris, and my college buddy Tom as we play a random game or a requested game for an hour and decide if it's worth playing past that hour. We go over the good, the bad, and maybe some little tidbits about the development you might not have known. Got 30 minutes? Give us a try, and if you like it, throw us a 5-star review. Try something new. You never know what might be your next favorite game.